Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I stared down at my text message on my cell phone as my phone suddenly pinged. It read, "Barker, meet me tonight at the head of the beaver trail behind Ian Fiersing's house at 12 o'clock sharp. It's very, very important. You cannot let your parents hear you creeping out of your bedroom window. You need to be very quiet. Make sure nobody hears a dicky bird out of you. I have something very important to show you that you're not going to believe. Our parents cannot know about any of this. Understood?" I stared at Felix's message incredulously, as why would my best friend want to meet up with me in the middle of the night in the woods like this? This would mean my leaving my bedroom by way of the bedroom window in our large 4-bedroom bungalow, which I still managed to squeeze through at a pinch. If I got any bigger, my way of access would have to be reconsidered, and I'd likely have to leave the house by way of the sliding doors from our living room. But there was one major problem about that. The living room was close to the main bedroom in our house, where my parents slept, and my mother was an annoyingly light sleeper, and the slightest noise seemed to awaken her, almost as if she slept with one eye open all the time, which I rather suspect she did, given how annoyingly pedantic she could be. I was 11 years old at the time and was growing up fast. It already looked like I would become extremely tall, rather like my father, who was 6'5" to be precise. I was already the tallest boy in my class at school. Sometimes it made me feel awkward to sense that I was bigger than all my peers, and half the time I found myself looking down on them, almost as if I was standing up on a whole pile of books, which in effect made me feel like a miniature giant, and it didn't help that a couple of boys at school had already started to call me Beanstalk. I even looked exactly like my father, with my Nordic locks of blonde hair and accompanying ice blue eyes. That was a typical family trait in the Lunderville family line. Everyone said that me and my father were the splitting image of each other. It made me feel extremely proud to look like my father, for certainly at 11 years old, I considered my father to be my hero, as most boys my age obviously do. And to be fair, he was an extremely good-looking man. Once my father had been stopped in the street by a local woman and asked if he was a Palladian from the Pallades, which sounded rather exotic to me. But my father had to disappoint the woman, who asked him this, by assuring her that no, he was not from outer space. I knew my father's Viking ancestry was Norwegian, as was my mother's, so everyone in our entire family had the typical blonde hair and accompanying ice blue eyes, from aunts, uncles and grandparents alike, without exception. The nuts and bolts of it all was that my entire extended family were all tall and blonde. I knew unequivocally that if my parents had an inkling about what I was getting up to that night, they would be less than amused by my intrepid nocturnal activities. My mother Astrid would likely throw a wobbly, because she had a tendency to be far too overprotective towards me, much more so than your average Norwegian parent, which is unusual for people from Norway, because they tend to be very carefree and relaxed about things, but not my mother, who could so easily get her knickers in the twist about the tiniest things that upset her. I knew once I'd squeezed through the bedroom window that I would discreetly have to amble across our front yard to reach the bicycle shed. Sadly, our old sheepdog Jasper had died a month earlier of old age. I missed the dog desperately, but if he were around he would have made quite a commotion, as my furtive activities would not go unnoticed by him, and that would almost certainly have roused my parents from their slumber. So in a way it was a good thing he wasn't around. When I got to the shed, where my bicycle was stored in its bicycle rack, next to the 2 other bicycles that belonged to my parents, the door would always rattle precariously and make one hell of a clanging noise that sounded like pots and pans being jangled together very noisily. My father told me the door made such a horrible commotion because the shed was a very old building that was older than the bungalow, and the door probably needed a very good oiling. My father was notoriously unreliable when it came to keeping up with the general maintenance jobs around our home, something which my mother found very frustrating. My father infinitely preferred to spend his spare time mountain biking, fishing, hiking, or even whitewater rafting with friends. Once I had got to the shed, I'd have to open the door as discreetly as I could, doing my damnedest not to make a noise, if that was at all possible in the circumstances. I would then grab my mountain bike from its rack and hand-wheel it down our asphalt driveway. I would then mount my bicycle once I reached our gate, which then opened up onto the road on our street. I would cycle past about 8 other houses on either side of the road, all nestling on substantial plots of land, until I reached the bottom of the cul-de-sac, where there was a trail called the Beaver Trail that ran behind Ian Fiersing's property, who was known by many as the idiosyncratic neighbourhood recluse. Nobody knew much about Ian Fiersing, although naturally the inquisitive gossips in our local neighbourhood asked many questions about the man, but nobody had any answers about him, even though he'd lived at the house at the bottom of our street that he called the Den for over 20 long years. He pretty much remained a mystery in our neck of the woods. My mother had seen him shopping in town once or twice and tried to approach him to say hello, but he had quickly scurried away, but she was almost certain he'd seen her. People in our neighbourhood had long since stopped inviting him to the barbecue held once a year at the Barlow property, as Ian Fiersing had promptly declined every invitation with a formal note card saying that he would be unable to attend. My mother had a theory that Ian Fiersing was probably an old vet who had been emotionally damaged from fighting in the Vietnam War and was suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome, which was why he was hiding away in that house of his, shutting himself off from the world while licking his war wounds, which she believed were not physical but deeply emotional. "Men are never the same," she would say, "once they've fought in a war. It does something to the human psyche, you know." I'm not sure where my mother got the idea that Ian Fiersing was a military vet who had fought in Afghanistan or Vietnam, but it seemed plausible enough to us, and certainly explained the man's obvious reluctance to interact with the locals in our community. "We need to just let the man be," my mother would say. "He obviously doesn't want to interact with any of the locals, and we need to respect that." I do recall at Halloween we ceased knocking on Ian Fiersing's front door for trick or treat. We knew he'd never answer the door to us. My mother would always say that Ian Fiersing lived in the world but was disconnected to everything in it, rather like a phone wire that still has not been linked to the cable networks. So this old recluse who lived at the house at the bottom of the street, that was in front of woods and a plethora of walking trails, remained but a mystery to us. The Beaver Trail behind Ian Fiersing's slightly dilapidated run-down shack of a bungalow led straight into the woods and branched out for what seemed like an eternity. I knew it was at the beginning of the Beaver Trail, where Felix and I would likely leave our bicycles that night. This would be our meeting rendezvous, where I would soon learn about this so-called exciting secret he had to convey to me. Although, to be fair, I wasn't sure whether this was a good secret or a bad one. I had never visited the Beaver Trail at night before, nor had I ever considered doing so, because if the truth be told, I was desperately afraid of going into a densely wooded area in the middle of the night, especially one that was rumoured to be haunted, as at 11 years old I was very intimidated by thoughts of the paranormal, and I'd been fixated by ghost stories on television for years. So yes, I was scared, but I'd never have admitted that honestly to Felix for fear of him thinking that I was a complete wuss. Felix and I would visit the Woodgrove regularly during the daylight hours, usually after school, and certainly on the weekends. But this was completely different. For some reason, our rather overprotective parents were pretty cool about us exploring the woods during the daylight hours, because they were close enough to our home and didn't cause our parents too much concern. But going on the beaver trail during the day was one thing. Visiting the place at night seemed like a whole different ballgame altogether, especially given the haunted reputation of the woods that both my cynical parents would say was absolute nonsense. But then again, neither of my parents believed in ghosts. Whenever my mother caught me tuning into a ghost investigation story on television, she would roll her eyes at me in exasperation and say, "Don't tell me, Barker, you believe in all that absolute nonsense." I would tell her that of course I didn't believe in it, but if the truth be told, I very much believed that ghosts were real. Over the years there had been stories about the woods at the back of Ian Fiersing's property. My mother told me that Ian Fiersing had called the police out to the woods on one occasion, where he reported to the officer that he'd seen a woman covered with blood, wearing a white nightdress, screaming for help. But he said she looked so affrighted, and then just ran directly back into the woods. He claimed she looked as if she'd been stabbed in the upper chest, as her nightdress was dappled in crimson flecks of blood. He had tried to run after her to help her, but he claimed she had vanished in plain sight, so he then called the police. When several police officers arrived at the scene, they combed the woodgrove at the back of Ian Fiersing's property thoroughly, where he'd claimed to have seen the distraught woman. There was no sign of the woman to be found anywhere. The police were perturbed over this rather peculiar incident, for Ian Fiersing didn't look like the kind of man that would fabricate a fictitious story like this. As a recluse, he naturally hated drawing attention to himself, and calling the police over to his property to investigate this somewhat paradoxical situation was inviting unwanted attention to himself that he was far from keen to receive. It would seem he was very detailed in the report that he gave to the police, and was most insistent that the woman he had seen was in desperate need of help and close to death, because she was severely injured. It seemed no one in our neighbourhood knew what to make of this enigmatic, very bizarre story. One of the police officers was so intrigued after hearing Ian Fiersing's very detailed account, so he decided to look up old police reports that dated back to the 1950s. It would seem on the 8th of July 1952, a woman wearing a nightdress covered in blood was found in the woods lying deceased. My mother told me that her body was missing both an arm and a foot. It was believed a small animal had been dining on her decomposing carcass. The woman's name was Deirdre Horace, but she was known to her friends as Dee. She was discovered there by a man called Graham Carter, who was a local to the area and was on his way to fish at the creek. He found Deirdre's body lying across the footpath at the head of the beaver trail. Ostensibly, the graphic, rather unnerving sight of her deceased corpse had given him quite the shock, and had ended his fishing excursion before it had even started. The deceased corpse of Deirdre Horace was covered in a fine scattering of leaves, which suggested to the police that someone had attempted to lightly bury her in a shallow grave. But it looked like her body had been dug up and ambitiously dragged across the path by a scavenging, hungry wild animal. The police, on investigating the reports, found that Deirdre Horace's husband Herbert had been known to be abusive towards his wife when he became drunk. The 25-year-old woman had confided in her sister Evelyn that when Herbert got excessively drunk, she was terrified of the man because he became so violently aggressive, and on 2 occasions had been waving around a knife, threatening to stab her. It was believed that Evelyn had told her sister Deirdre to leave her husband at once, but sadly Deirdre Horace had not listened to her sister Evelyn's wise, well-meaning advice, insisting that her husband Herbert had given her his solemn word that he'd never ever drink again, because she had warned him that if he did, she'd leave him at once. It would seem her words had not been enough to bring a halt to Herbert's addiction to alcohol. Deirdre Horace and her husband Herbert lived in the den where Ian Fiersing now resided, although at the time Ian Fiersing's house was called the Beavers, probably because the land stretched out into two trails, one known as the Beaver Trail, where Deirdre Horace's body had been found, and the other more challenging uphill trail was called the Skywalk Trail. Deirdre Horace's husband Herbert had gone out for the evening to play cards with friends, but when he returned home that night, after Deirdre had retired to bed, she discovered he was drunk. He had insisted that he would never drink again, so he had betrayed her trust. It was believed that Deirdre got incredibly angry. Her husband was slurring his words and smelt strongly of booze, and so his cacophony of lies did not fool her when he told her that he had not been drinking. Deirdre was furious, and she told her husband that given he'd failed to keep his promise to her, she would be leaving him and calling her sister Evelyn to pick her up from the house within the next hour or so. Deirdre returned to her bedroom in her nightdress and began to throw her clothes together in a suitcase. When Herbert saw what his wife was doing, he begged her not to leave him and promised his wife he'd never ever drink again. But Deirdre was tired of his broken promises and was determined to leave her life at the Beavers behind, and certainly her husband. In a fit of abhorrent rage, Herbert Horace entered the bedroom with a knife, threatening his wife with it, and then he began to mercilessly stab her several times. At some point, because he was so unstable on his feet because of his drunkenness, Deirdre had managed to push him over, so he collapsed on the floor in a heap, and in that second she had taken flight from the house. It would seem, despite being seriously injured, after having been stabbed several times in the chest, Deirdre had run into the woods to take cover from her rampaging, indignant husband, but unfortunately she quickly succumbed to her injuries and collapsed on the forest floor and died. It was believed that Herbert found his wife lying there deceased and buried her in a shallow grave, which he lazily covered with leaves and twigs. But unfortunately for him, a wild animal had dug up the corpse and dragged it across the forest floor to the head of the Beaver Trail, where it would easily be found. According to the police report, Deirdre's husband Herbert Horace was arrested once the body of his wife was found. He served out the rest of his life in prison and was very remorseful for what he'd done, claiming that his wife Deirdre was a gentle soul who didn't deserve any of this. He also claimed that he was devastated to have stabbed his wife and had no recollection of the event. His only defence was when he got drunk, he became violent and couldn't remember what he'd done, but no one felt any sympathy for the man. Some people in our neighbourhood wondered if Ian Fiersing had by chance encountered the ghost of Deirdre Horace on the evening in question, when he'd seen the woman in the white nightdress, soaked with blood, that was so close to death, for the woman had fit Deirdre Horace's description so perfectly, which was another reason that going into the woods did not exactly float my boat. Let's just say the thought of encountering the ghost of Deirdre Horace frightened me half to death. Everyone living in our neighbourhood knew about the tragic story of Deirdre Horace, and one of the locals living in our street, a man called Paul Redfern, that my parents knew very well, claimed that once on a very rainy, overcast night, he'd seen a woman standing on the side of the road, getting covered in rain. Totally soaked she was, and rivulets of red were streaming down her cheeks, which he knew at once must be blood. He claimed the woman was wearing what appeared to be a white nightdress, and was covered with blood. Her long hair appeared to be wild around her face. She was mouthing the words, help me, please." Poor Redfern was startled to see this woman, that was clearly badly injured and in a dreadful state. He didn't know what to make of it. He knew she needed help, and needed to get to the hospital as quickly as possible, or she would likely succumb to the violence of her injuries. He intended to take the woman to the hospital himself, for she was in a bad way. He stopped his Range Rover immediately and jumped out of the driver's side seat to call the woman over. But when he looked to the place where the woman had been standing only moments before, getting soaked by the rain, she was all but gone, and was nowhere to be seen. He claimed he thought he'd been losing his mind. He said when he continued to drive, he felt a very obvious presence next to him in the car, as if somebody was sitting next to him on the passenger side seat, but he saw nothing. When he returned home, He was very rattled and rather affrighted by the whole experience. He said that the passenger side seat was so freezing cold to touch. And then he discovered to his horror that it was stained in blood. He had no explanation as to where the blood had come from, apart from it being from the woman. But the following day, when he returned to his Range Rover to show his wife the curious bloodstains in the passenger seat, they were all but gone. Many locals living in our street often complained that they heard strange noises coming from the woods, and some had seen mysterious flashing lights and orbs. Many believed the woodgrove was haunted, but my parents never believed a single word of it, although they knew the story of Deirdre Horace was true, but they didn't believe her ghostly spectre was haunting the woodgrove at night. But as to what Paul Redfern had seen on that rainy night, I must admit my parents were both given pause for thought, but were not ready to admit that Mr. Redfern may well have actually seen the ghost of Deirdre Horace. There were 2 trails in the woods for outdoor enthusiasts that only the locals seemed to know about, for I never ever saw outsiders using the trails, and realized that the trails had never been advertised or even placed upon any map of the region, for reasons I cannot explain. My parents believed that this was an oversight, as much of the land had initially belonged to the Beavers, where Ian Fiercing currently resided, and called the Den. The previous owner of the Beavers was a distant relative of the Horace family, and he gave most of the attached land on the property to the public to use in his last will and testament, while he left the Beavers' house itself to one of his daughters, who I imagine sold the property to Ian Fiercing. One of the trails was called Skywalk Trail, which earned its name because it led up a mountainous incline through the woods where you'd see flashes of blue sky through the trees, and when you reached the top of the mountainous elevation, you could see views for miles around, and it was quite spectacular, because you felt as if you were on top of the entire world. I had been on the Skywalk Trail less than a handful of times, as there was a great deal of uphill trekking involved, and it meant you would get out of breath and work up quite the sweat. Furthermore, the trail was dappled with a plethora of loose stones, and many challenging obstacle courses that you needed to navigate very well and overcome. And dare I say you'd have to be pretty nimble on your feet, as the walk was decidedly treacherous, and after the rain fell, it could be seriously slippery, and more than a little precarious. Some said there were even caves among the rocks there, but me and my best friend Felix didn't go exploring there, because it was too much like hard work for us. We preferred to take the easy-going, more comfortable path that was not too taxing for our young bodies or our bicycles. Most people who knew about the trails barely ever took the Skywalk Trail, and who could blame them for that? The other trail was of course the Beaver Trail, which was very well known to us. It was perfect for cyclists, runners and walkers alike. It also led to a beautiful creek which ran through the woods and was a popular location for people who wanted to go fishing. It was also extremely well maintained. There were some seriously big catfish in that creek, along with some wild trout that Felix and I had caught on several occasions. The creek was our quintessential favourite place to go, where we would hang out together and talk. Sometimes we would paddle in the shallow end of the water, our chinos rolled up to our knees, or we would compete against each other, skimming stones on the surface of the water to see who had the best technique. Sometimes we'd swim there on a hot day. But what would it be like at night, I wondered privately to myself. Probably quite spooky, I would think. I tried my best not to entertain such a very uncomfortable thought. I read my cell phone message from Felix again. What was so incredibly secret that Felix couldn't share it with me on my cell phone right now, or at least arrange to meet me in a few minutes' time at our usual spot in the grove, where we would ride our mountain bikes down the Beavers Trail until we reached the creek, where we would sit on the river bank and talk like we often did, while we listened to the sound of the fast-moving water as it glided over the rocks. We may have lived in neighbouring properties right next door to each other, but never once had we crept out of our houses at the dead of night to meet up with each other during the witching hour for a secret rendezvous like this before. When reading Felix's rather unorthodox message, an excited shiver ran down my spine. A secret, I thought to myself. I rather liked the sound of that. This was a secret that not even our parents could know about. While I was somewhat excited about meeting up with Felix at the dead of night, another part of me was more than a little reluctant and rather apprehensive, as I thought about the ghostly spectre of Deirdre Horace wearing a white nightdress covered in blood. Imagine if I encountered her ghostly spectre in the woods myself. It would seriously freak me out. I reminded myself that Paul Redfern and Ian Fierceling had probably encountered the ghost before, so why shouldn't it happen to me? I quickly tapped back in my cell phone to respond to Felix's earnest message. "Why can't you talk to me about the secret now? We could meet at the creek in about 10 minutes' time if you like. Mum won't mind. We've never met at the creek at night before. It could be a little scary, don't you think, when it's so dark outside?" Felix's reply was teasing. "What, are you a wuss or something? Scared of running into the ghost of Deirdre Horace, are you? Wearing a white nightdress soaked in her blood? Come on, don't tell me you believe that crap." "Of course I'm not a wuss," I texted back quickly. "It's just we've never met up at night before, have we? And if my mum caught me sneaking out in the middle of the night, she'd do her nuts. You know what she's like. She's even worse than your mother is, and that's saying something." I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised by Felix's response, for he was not afraid of anything. We had talked about the so-called ghost of Deirdre Horace often enough. As being curious kids by nature, stories about ghosts had always intrigued the both of us. Me more so than Felix, I have to confess. I hasten to say Felix, much like my parents, said it was nonsense and ghosts did not exist. But I was less sure about that. I liked the fact that Felix's mother, Glenda Featherstone, would always say that she thought that ghosts might indeed be real, and that Ian Fiercing's experience and strange encounter of the woman in white that had been covered in blood had certainly given her a great deal to think about. I remember her saying once, "You must remember, a man like Ian Fiercing keeps himself to himself. He's always been reclusive like that. He's a private, reticently reserved man, and hates any kind of intrusion in his private life. If the old bugger claims he saw that woman in the middle of the night, wearing a nightdress soaked in blood, who was so obviously in distress that he went as far as to call out the police about it, I'm rather inclined to believe his story. I don't think a man like Ian Fiercing would spin a yarn. He saw something that night, and based on his description, I think he saw the ghost of Deirdre Horace. I really do. What other explanation can there be? And then, of course, there's Paul Redfern, who saw that woman standing on the side of the road, also wearing a white nightdress soaked in blood. 2 witnesses to the same event on different days. I think there's something to it." Felix had laughed out loud at his mother. "So you think Ian Fiercing and Paul Redfern saw the ghost of Deirdre Horace? Is that what you're saying, Mum? Do you realise how crazy that sounds? That's insane. You and your father can ridicule me as much as you like. If you must know, I do believe that both Ian Fiercing and Paul Redfern both were witness to Deirdre Horace's ghost. It saddens me to think that the poor woman is still distraught in the afterlife. She's probably a lost soul looking for help because she's been stabbed. My guess is she doesn't even realise she's dead." Felix cracked up laughing at his mother's response and said, "Seriously, Mum, you don't believe that, do you? Dad says there's no such thing as ghosts." "Well, I would expect that from your father. Nothing less from him. Your father says many things, Felix," said Glenda Featherstone, pulling a face, shaking her short bob of dark hair. "You know what your father's like. He's got a scientific brain on him. And that's the quintessential problem with men like your father. Anything that challenges their logic is something they considered nonsensical. I always say this to your father, and that is there are more things on heaven and earth, and we can't claim to know everything. To assume we know it all makes us extremely ignorant and very arrogant. A wise man who claims he knows little is indeed wise, but a man who claims to know it all is a fool indeed as far as I'm concerned." Glenda had turned to look at me directly. A big warm glow dappled her pretty brown eyes. I was slightly uncomfortable when she did this, as she always gave me that adoring look that was far too over-familiar for me. "What do you think, Barker?" she asked me directly. "Do you think Ian Fiercing saw the ghost of Deirdre Horace that night, when he reported seeing that strange woman wearing a nightdress covered in blood? And what about Paul Redfern, seeing the woman on the side of the road in the pouring rain, wearing the same nightdress covered in blood? Do you think he saw her ghost as well?" "I don't know, Mrs. Featherstone," I said. "That's a difficult question to answer." "He's just being polite, Mum," Felix had interjected. "He doesn't want to be rude, but he doesn't believe in ghosts, do you, Barker?" he said, answering Mrs. Featherstone's question for me. "Why don't you let Barker answer for himself?" said Mrs. Featherstone, looking slightly peeved by her son's intrusive manner. "It's very rude to answer your friend's questions for him. He is quite capable of answering them himself." "Well, Mrs. Featherstone," I said very gingerly, "I do think you've got a good point with what you're saying. I'm not saying that ghosts are real, but I'm saying there's a possibility that they might be. I mean, I know that a recluse like Ian Fiercing, well, he definitely saw a woman that night, wearing a white dress with blood all over it. I don't believe a man like him, who is so reserved and so reticent, would make up something like that. He's not the type. And then, of course, when it comes to Paul Redfern, well, my parents know the man very well. My mother says he would never lie about anything. So he must have seen something. And there were two of them that saw this woman in white. So I don't know what to make of it all." "My thoughts exactly, Barker," said Glenda Featherstone approvingly. I looked down at my cell phone. It suddenly pinged again. Felix had answered my message, so I quickly scrolled through his text, hoping that our nightly rendezvous would be cancelled and Felix would not leave his secret sitting on ice. Hopefully he'd agree to meet me in the woods in about 10 minutes' time. But his message left me bitterly disappointed. "No, it must be tonight under the cover of darkness," came his prompt reply. "It's very important, Barker, that your parents must not see you leave the house. Understood? Oh, by the way, you're going to need a very good torch, because it's going to be dark outside. We'll meet at the beaver trailhead, park our bicycles there against a tree. Then we will walk into the woods. Cycling's not a good idea. Our visibility might be impaired, even with torches. We'll walk to the creek on foot, talk there on the river bank, so that only the fish can hear us. I don't mind sharing the secret with them," he joked. "Fish don't gossip like people do." "Understood," I replied. "See you at 12 tonight, providing, of course, I can still squeeze through my bedroom window, because I'm not getting any smaller. And if I attempt to go through the sliding doors of the living room, my mother will surely wake up, and I can't let that happen." "Make sure you get through your bedroom window then," came Felix's reply. "This is very important, Barker. We have to meet tonight. What I tell you, well, what I'm going to tell you, absolutely cannot wait. I'm telling you, it's going to be quite the shock for you." It was over dinner that night that my mother noticed I wasn't making much of a showing on my evening meal, and concern dappled her piercing ice-blue eyes. She studied my plate rather fixedly, and I could easily read her thoughts, as if they were as unambiguous as an open book. "You're not hungry, Barker, I see," she said, raising a questioning brow. "Now that is a first. When have you not had second or third helpings? What on earth is up with you? You've barely made any showing on that plate of yours." My father, who ate his food at the speed of a rocket in takeoff, looked somewhat bemused by my overfull plate that I was struggling to work my way through. Normally I was so like my father in this regard, and would bolt down all my food, faster than a starved dog, and usually I was eager to demand both second and third helpings, but not tonight, it would seem. My mind was 1,000,000,000,000,000 miles away, as I thought about the big, wonderful secret that Felix had to convey to me. later that night, when the clock moved closer to the witching hour. There was something so uncannily bewildering, yet at the same time enigmatical, about the urgency of Felix's text that had both succeeded in rattling me and intriguing me. I wondered what the mystery was all about, and why it was so poignantly important to meet Felix in the dead of night like this, at such a godless, unholy hour. What could be so desperately important to tell me that it strictly had to be told to me under the cover of darkness, in an inauspicious woodgrove known to be haunted at night by the ghost of Deirdre Horace herself? It would seem the thrill within my body was being messily tangled up with an earnest sense of disquiet. I will admit I was so caught up in the bubble of my curiosity that I was involuntarily suppressing my primal instincts to eat, for my hunger for some reason had simply abandoned me, and even the delicious savoury aromatic smells of my mother's steaming, piping hot food did nothing to stimulate what I would normally describe as an insatiable appetite on my part. "Son, this is not like you," said my father, who was working his way through his second helping of stewed beef and creamy mashed potatoes by now, and was currently greedily shuffling down a forkful of beef and potato in his mouth, as if desperately afraid that if he didn't eat his food fast enough, a voucher might swoop out of nowhere and steal his dinner away from him. My mother would complain tirelessly that me and my father ate far too fast, so much so that we barely got an opportunity to even taste our food. "You're as bad as each other," she would regularly say. "Do you not know how rude it is to shovel your food down like this? Can you not eat a little slower, perhaps? And try to be gracious enough to pause between mouthfuls. I'm sure it's not healthy to gobble your food down so rapidly, without even chewing it first. It can't be good for you. If you ate your food a little slower, you might actually enjoy it more. I would be absolutely mortified, I have to tell you, if any of my friends were to see you right now. They would think you were starving the way you polish off your food on your plates. And I have a suspicion, if I weren't looking, you'd lick your plates clean too. You could both learn some good manners. We can do all that polite stuff and eat slowly when we're around our guests, or if we're entertaining friends," my father would say to my mother. "But at home, me and Barker can eat as we please. And when I'm hungry, I always eat fast. I've always been like this, love. You know that about me. Why change the habits of a lifetime? And for your information, I do taste my food, thank you very much, and enjoy it just as much as the next man. I'm sure that eating food fast doesn't mean you miss out on the taste." "Really? Is that how you see it?" my mother would say, looking a tad exasperated. "Sometimes I despair with the both of you, I really do. It wouldn't hurt to mind your manners from time to time." But I'm afraid my mother's words fell on deaf ears, for extreme hunger dictated how fast me and my father usually ate, and we always seemed to be ravenously hungry by the time dinner came around. In my case, I suspected I had an insatiable appetite because I was growing up fast. In 2 months my feet had grown so much bigger that my mother had to replace my new shoes that I had already outgrown. While my father's case was straightforward enough, as he was a physically very big man, not only in terms of his height, but his strength as well. He probably needed way more calories than your average man. And my father's feet were so enormously big, my mother struggled to find his shoe size when they went shopping together, and on several occasions she'd actually ordered shoes straight from Norway, as they had a much wider range of sizes for men like my father, with bigger feet. My father could eat absolutely anything he wanted, without gaining a single pound of weight. My mother described our stomachs as like 2 bottomless pits that could never be filled, satiated, or satisfied. She was always bitterly complaining that her food bill was excessively steep, due to the unfortunate fact that both me and my father ate way too much. Whenever she went to the supermarket, our 2 trolleys were stacked to the nines and piled high with so much food they barely managed to contain it all. It looked like my mother was feeding an entire army. Some shoppers would casually ask my mother if she happened to be having a party. She'd simply nod her head politely. She didn't want to tell the people, "No, my family gets through all this embarrassingly large quantity of food in a single week." along with this insane amount of ice cream, because they're big eaters. She didn't want to tell them that. It was ironic on this occasion she was complaining on my poor showing this evening. You'd think she'd be glad I wasn't bolting down my food like a half-starved animal for a change. But she wasn't happy about my poor showing that I'd made that evening. Probably because it was so out of character for me to show zero interest in my food. "Your father's absolutely right," said my mother, unable to disguise the maternal concern in her voice. "You're not coming down with something, are you, Barker?" She reached over to run a hand over my forehead as she tried to test my temperature. "Or a fever, perhaps, are you?" "No, I'm not," I snapped. "I'm fine." I was at an age when I always winced when my mother touched me. I hated being fussed over. It felt so patronizing. Felix's mother, Glenda Featherstone, was always touching me as well and looking at me with adoringly pathetic eyes. It rarely made me want to heave, for I absolutely abhorred being fussed over like this. I often wondered privately to myself if all women were wired to be like this. "Well, I'm very glad to say your temperature's normal, dear," my mother said, finally retracting her hand from my forehead. There was concern in her eyes as she studied me like a hawk, as if she wanted to ensure that she hadn't overlooked something. Finally she said in a more softer but guarded tone of voice, "Someone hasn't upset you at school, have they, Barker?" She asked me, her jaw stiffening, as she waited somewhat impatiently for my response. The look she was giving me was as potent as a truth serum. So had I been lying to her, she'd have known about it at once. My father once again looked up from his dinner plate. His chewing slowed down substantially, as worry also washed over his face, rather like an ominous dark shadow. "Son, if something's troubling you, or someone said something to upset you at school, I hope you would tell us about it. There are no secrets in this household. You cannot fix a problem if you don't talk about it, can you? You must always tell me and your mother what's going on at school, or if someone is bullying you, as me and your mother would never stand for such nonsense." I was somewhat taken aback that my parents thought I might be being bullied, for goodness sake. I mean, it just made me smile, the very idea of it, given I towered over them all, rather like a giraffe over a scattering of rabbits in a field. No one would dare bully me at school. I was the tallest boy in the class. Sometimes I did get called String Bean because of my great height, but if anyone tried to screw with me, they wouldn't stand a chance, as I was so much bigger and stronger than they were. "Well, that's an awful relief," said my mother with a happy sigh. "You had me worried there for a moment, Barker. You really did." My parents were not the kind of people you confided in, for they would address any problem I had as tactlessly as a raging bull in a china shop, and I knew that very well from experience. When I was 8 years old, for example, and I wasn't particularly big at that time, like I am now, as the growth spurts happened much later on in my life. A boy in the school, I don't remember his name, was in the playground and he punched me in the face. The next thing my mother was paying the family a visit to tell them what their son had done to me and how I'd been unfairly bullied by him. The boy in question was severely reprimanded by his parents, but he let it be known at school among all the other kids that I had run to my mummy and daddy because I was such a big baby to tell them what he'd done. Everyone began to call me a tattletale tit and a big wuss who couldn't fight his own battles unless he called upon his mummy and daddy for support, which was deeply humiliating for a young boy. Ostensibly from the ages of 7 to 9, I was a small kid, but by the time I reached 10 years old, I shot up, and those same kids would never dare to challenge me, as let's just say physically, I could overcome them all in a fist fight, and they would be the ones that would end up drawing the short straw. It was well known at my school among my peers that if you had an issue with me, my mother would soon sandwich herself in the heart of the matter with the same bulldozing fierceness and tenacity of a dung beetle, determined to involve herself in every issue and get caught up in all the dirt it might entail. This was hugely embarrassing for an 11-year-old, so even if I were having issues at school, I would never tell my parents about it, for I would be teased mercilessly if that were the case. Both my parents were quiet for a brief moment, and a rather unnatural silence descended across the dinner table, as my father's chewing had all but subsided, so much so that you could have heard a pin drop. My parents' piercing ice-blue eyes were fixed on me steadily, as they seemed to think that I should be giving them a full explanation as to why I had suddenly lost my appetite. If I wasn't hungry, for goodness sake, I wasn't hungry. Why wouldn't they accept that? There wasn't anything abnormal about not being hungry. I could feel the familiar annoyance building up inside me. I didn't believe all parents were like this. They needed to know everything about me, everything that I did. Why I wasn't eating, why I was wearing a red t-shirt, why I hadn't finished my homework yet. You cannot believe the questions they assaulted me with on a daily basis, most especially my mother, who sometimes made me feel as if I was being interrogated by the police themselves. It would seem all the whys they spat out at me regularly had become increasingly infuriating. Sometimes I struggled to contain my annoyance. Having said that, I also found that Felix's parents were equally as bad as mine were. They incongruously also wanted to know so much about me as well, the details of my life, when it was no business of theirs at all. They treated me like a second son, so the interaction between both of the families was more than a little bizarre, to say the least. But I was used to the Featherstones' heavy involvement in my life, and how both families appeared to watch over the both of us, like hawks, and I never understood why. When my mother picked me and Felix up from school, she seemed to interrogate the both of us on the car ride home. She was always embarrassingly the first parent to arrive at the school gate, 15 to 20 minutes before all the other mothers. Felix lived next door to us, so it made perfect sense for her to give him a ride home, to kill two birds with one stone, so to speak. My mother insisted on picking me up from school every day, even though Felix and I could easily have caught a school bus, or even been part of a lift club with other parents. But my mother would have it no other way, and didn't trust anyone to ferry me around, apart from herself. It would seem that even with Felix in the car sitting right next to me, my mother shamelessly, unabashedly wanted to know every aspect of our day, and was as nosy about Felix's thoughts on things as she was of mine. Whether she was doing this to be polite to Felix, I was never quite sure, but she seemed to be equally as interested in what Felix had to say for himself as she was in what I had to say. She appeared to smile at him intimately, in the same way that Glenda Featherstone would smile at me. She would ask us all kinds of stupid questions, like what we'd learnt in English that day, what the teacher was wearing, what did we talk about in the school playground. My mother's questions were excruciatingly embarrassing, but Felix was a good sport and answered all her questions politely. He had been raised to be respectful of his elders, and my mother appeared to have such a soft spot for Felix that it sometimes made me jealous. I once accused her of liking Felix better than she liked me, which she became incredibly defensive about. "What are you talking about, Barker? Felix is your best friend. Of course I like him. I ask him questions because I'm interested in him. What's wrong with that? But you're my son. You come first in everything. It's always been that way." "Then why do I sometimes feel that you like Felix better than you like me?" "For goodness sake, Barker," my mother had snorted. "You do only half talk nonsense sometimes." I wasn't so sure I was talking nonsense. I knew my mother really, really liked Felix, and sometimes I privately wondered if she'd prefer it if he were her son, but I kept such thoughts to myself. My father was very demure by nature. He wasn't a particularly talkative person, but he was also meddling and prying when it came to me and Felix, always asking us way too many questions. When I asked other children at school if their parents behaved like my parents did, I was met with a resounding no. So why on earth were my parents and Felix's parents so intrusive? I couldn't answer that question. Maybe my mother and Felix's mother hung around each other too much, and they became like two birds of a feather, rubbing off on each other in some way. There were times my mother would insist that I could not go on a school camping trip with my classmates or on some other school expedition that would take us further away from home. I would ask both of my parents why I couldn't go on this camping trip, and my overprotective mother would simply say, What if something dreadful were to happen to you, Barker? How would I be able to protect you? I'm not a baby, Mum. I can look after myself. All the other kids are going. Why can't I go? Why are you so mean? Don't talk to your mother like that, my father would say. Your mother's looking out for you, that's all. Felix's mother, Glenda Featherstone, would also resolutely refuse to let her son Felix go out on any of those extra-school events. She and my mother were practically joined at the hip and agreed on absolutely everything that was being discussed. If I wasn't going on a school camping trip, neither was Felix, and that was that. The discussion was closed. The decision was final. There was absolutely no negotiation about the matter, even if our school teachers tried to persuade our parents otherwise, that it was in our interest to go. Our parents would just point-blank refuse. The irony is that our parents, although regimentally protective towards the both of us, despite their strict rules, they would let me and Felix cycle to the Woodgrove, which was on a trail behind Ian Fiersing's property, at the cul-de-sac at the bottom of our street. It was here we would spend hours together happily at the creek that ran through the woods, and was our quintessential place to hang out. It occurred to me that bad things could happen as easily to us close to home here in the Woodgrove, but I never challenged my parents on this thought, for fear they would suddenly ban us from going into the woods altogether, and I couldn't allow that to happen, because bang would go our freedom. I will say this, that there was something strange about the way the Featherstones had shamelessly weaved their way into our family's lives, almost as if they had become part of the furniture, more so than even our grandparents. Even when we went on family vacations, the Featherstones always joined us. If that wasn't weird enough, every weekend without fail, our two families always enjoyed a Sunday barbecue together. It was almost as if the Featherstones had become part of our extended family, even though they weren't remotely related to us. My mother was closer to Glenda Featherstone than she was to her own sister. It was hardly surprising that in these unfathomable circumstances, Felix and I became the very best of friends. We were always placed together, rather like two marbles being put into a velvety bag side by side. I'm not sure that we'd have actually been best friends by choice, if we didn't happen to live next door to each other and spend copious amounts of time in each other's company, all because our parents appeared to be very close. I never fully understood or appreciated why this was the case. I do vividly recall telling Granny Ina about how overbearing my parents could be towards me at times, and she was very sympathetic and understanding about it. I do recall in her pale blue eyes, that were icier looking than mine, I had noticed a melancholic sadness in their depths, almost as if she was nursing an old memory that she really did not want to entertain. She had shaken her short-cropped head of snow-white hair and said, "Well, with what your parents have been through, I mean, can you blame them for being so overprotective towards you? Sometimes when you've had a nasty shock in life, it can really rattle up your entire world and change the way you do things." I had asked Granny Ina what she meant by this. Her face had grown pink, as if she was blushing. She hastily said, "Don't mind me, Barker. I'm just talking over my head. I don't half go on sometimes." "But what do you mean exactly, Granny Ina?" I had inquired. But Granny Ina ignored my question and promptly changed the subject, so obviously that I unequivocally knew she was hiding something from me, and I had a burning itch to know what it was. It did make me wonder what may have happened to me when I was younger that would have made my parents so overly protective towards me. It occurred to me that maybe I'd nearly drowned in a swimming pool as a little boy, as my parents might have come close to losing me, so it would make sense to me if they continually watched over my life in the obtrusive, meddlesome way that they obviously did. But I kept such private thoughts to myself. I knew if I'd nearly drowned in a swimming pool accident, my parents would never speak of such a thing, even if it had really happened. My mother had an irritating habit of brushing things she didn't want to discuss under the carpet. By all accounts, Felix shared a similar complaint to mine about his parents when we secretly aired our grievances together, usually when we were sitting on the bank by the creek. over the fact that our parents always seemed to be watching over us, rather like eagles watching over their younglings. We were both amazed they allowed us to go exploring in the woods and gave us that kind of freedom, given how proprietorial and possessively dominating they were. We both complained bitterly that at times we felt as if we were under 24 hours surveillance. "There is nothing going on, all right," I snapped that evening at my mother, as I toyed awkwardly with my food on my plate, slamming my fork angrily into the piece of beef that was so tender it broke apart. "I'm not hungry, that's all. It's no big deal. You're acting like it's a big deal, but it's not. I'm just not hungry." My mother took away my plate, along with my father's empty plate, and released a heavy sigh, which I was sure was deliberate. "There is no need for you to snap at me, Barker. Me and your father are concerned about you, that's all. You normally love your food so much, so when you're not eating, I'm entitled to worry. That's what I do. I'm your mother. I tell you what, how about I get you some ice cream? I've got your favourite snickerdoodle ice cream in the freezer. I know how much you love that flavour. How about I throw some sprinkles on it for you? Make it extra special, as a treat." "I don't want snickerdoodle ice cream. I don't want sprinkles. Haven't you heard a single word I said?" I scoffed. "I told you, Mum, I'm not hungry." My mother was so taken aback by my sardonic retort, she looked as if I had delivered her a blow to the face. I was so irritated. My parents were all over me, like a burgeoning rash, simply because I wasn't eating my dinner that night, and I felt as if I was being smothered and unduly suffocated by them. As a result, I got up from the table and said, "I'm going to my bedroom now." "When you get up to leave the table, Barker," my mother retorted wryly, "it would be very nice if you would courteously say, 'Please, may I be excused?'" "May I be excused, Mum, please?" I said satirically. "That is so much better, Barker," my mother said, giving me a mock smile. "Of course you may be excused. Thank you for asking." As I walked away, I heard my mother's anxious voice saying to my dad in a muted whisper, "What on earth is going on with Barker? He's so angry tonight, so defensive and moody. He didn't touch his food. It's not like him to toy with his food like that. He normally wolfs it all down and asks for second and third helpings. And I've never yet known him to refuse snickerdoodle ice cream, especially with toppings." "Leave him be," my father said. "You worry far too much, love. Maybe our son needs some space. If you think this is bad, wait until he becomes a teenager. My guess is we haven't seen anything yet. He's going to get feisty when he gets older, and will likely think we're butting into his life. Let me tell you, when I was a teenager, I abhorred my parents' intrusion. They used to annoy me so much." "Oh, goodness gracious me," I heard my mother say. "Please don't say that. I would hate for Barker to make enemies of his parents. He's so special to me. He's my entire world." When I got into my bedroom, I texted Felix and told him that everything was on schedule and I would meet him at 12 that night. His response was very clear and concise. "See you then. You're not going to believe what I have to share with you. When I learned this, let me just tell you, I flipped." Suffice to say, Felix's text rather meant that getting to sleep that night was more than a little difficult. At 9 o'clock my mother entered my bedroom with a tray containing a glass of milk and a plate of chocolate chip cookies. She put them down on my desk in the corner and smiled coyly at me. "Just in case you get hungry, love, during the night," she said. "Thanks, Mum," I said, watching my mother close the bedroom door behind her and blowing me a kiss. I hastened to say I didn't touch the milk and cookies my mother had kindly brought me, because I wasn't hungry. I set the alarm on my cell phone diligently and played a few games to distract myself, but my mind was not focused on the games, as all I could think about was what it was that Felix had to tell me that was so secret. I was thinking that I would never get to sleep, as I had become so alert, but against the odds I drifted off and was awoken to the pinging sound of my cell phone going off. I reached over to my bedside lamp on the nightstand and switched on the light. so the dark shadows in my room retreated and bounced back, and everything was washed in a subdued glow. I quickly stared down at my cell phone to check the time. It was 15 minutes to 12. I had time to get dressed quickly and to slip out of the house via my bedroom window, making my way to the bottom of the street on the bicycle, where I would wait for Felix at the head of the beaver trail that ran down a path at the bottom of Ian Fierceling's rather dilapidated bungalow. I observed the glass of milk on my desk that my mother had left me, and realizing I was thirsty, I swigged it back, very gratefully. But at this point it was no longer warm and about to turn, so it didn't taste desperately pleasant. I quickly tiptoed over to my closet and threw on a pair of olive green chinos, some sneakers and a navy blue sweater, and then I placed a couple of pillows in my bed, underneath the covers, and artfully arranged them so it looked like a human body was sleeping in my bed. I did this in case my mother should look in on me during the night, and hopefully if she did, she would assume that the lump in the bed was obviously me. I then quietly glided over to my bedroom window, drew back the curtain ever so slightly, and I held my breath as I did my level best to squeeze through the small opening that the window provided, that seemed significantly smaller than I last remembered it to be. But luckily, because I was both long and lean, I slipped through the window with a few careful twists and turns relatively easily, until finally my big ungainly sneakered feet met the bed of grass on the other side of the window. I switched on my torch, even though a soft moonlight unblushingly spilled onto the backyard. The grass beneath my feet appeared to be rather damp. I could hear the crepuscular trills of crickets and frogs. I quickly glanced at the house, but apart from the crickets singing their tuneful chorus, everything was thankfully placidly quiet. I hurriedly ran from the backyard to the front yard, doing so as silently and as furtively as I could, as the last thing I wanted to do was to wake up my parents. By the time I reached the yard shed, I don't mind admitting my heart was pounding rather vigorously in my chest, for just opening the shed door invited a great deal of noise. As I expected, the door rattled, jangled, and precariously clamoured as it was swung open very discreetly. I glanced briefly towards the house to see if any lights would suddenly pop on, but all remained serene and still. I sighed with abject relief, but I knew I wasn't in the clear, not just yet. Not until I managed to get my bicycle off its rack. Soon I'd pulled out my jingling bicycle from the shed, and I'd like to say it was a quite seamlessly easy retrieval, but I'm afraid it was nothing of the kind, as the shed door creaked behind me, and the bicycle emitted a few unfortunate squeaks. I waited for a few vital seconds to see if the noises had alerted my parents, but thankfully no light came on in my parents' bedroom. I drew in an inward sigh of relief, because the noises I had made had seemed painfully loud. I guided my bicycle to the driveway and finally mounted it, and hurriedly cycled down the drive until I met the road on our street. In a trice I was cycling past houses on both sides of the street, all basked under the veil of darkness. Their shadowy silhouettes were ambiguously blurred. Finally I reached the cul-de-sac at the end of the road, and felt as if I'd been holding my breath all the way, almost as if I'd been diving underwater and had only just come up for air, rather like a seal under the ice. It was almost as if I was an autopilot as I cycled up the beaver trail, which was behind Ian Fierceling's bungalow, which I could see, like most of the houses on our street, appeared to be cast under a tenebrific veil of darkness, so its dilapidated appearance was shrouded by the dark shadows. But even in this half-dingy light, the bungalow looked somewhat menacing. It was a gloomy night for sure, that was cruelly corrupted by the absence of any light. I felt as if the dim ambience was cloying, for much of the moonlight seemed to have been confiscated by this dense cloud cover that appeared to have even held the silvery stars captive that usually jewelled the nightly sky with vast scatterings of silvery glitter, but not tonight, it would seem. Finally I reached the beaver trail, dismounting my bike very carefully and balancing it against a tree. I discovered that Felix's bike was already balanced against another tree, so he must be here already. Then I saw him. He was already waiting for me, if not rather impatiently. In fact, he looked rather peeved. "What took you so long?" he whispered, a scowl pulling down the edges of his mouth. "For a moment I thought you'd overslept and that you weren't coming. I said 12 o'clock. It's 12:05 already. You're late." "But I'm on time," I insisted. "And anyway, what's 5 minutes? What's the big secret, Felix? Are you going to tell me now or not? I'm bursting to know." "I'm not telling you out here. Not around here," said Felix, looking around himself rather nervously, almost as if he half expected our parents to come crawling from underneath the undergrowth like a couple of raccoons and saying, "We've got you." "I told you, we're sharing the secret by the creek, so only the fish can eavesdrop on our conversation. It's very important no one hears us, especially not our parents. What I have to tell you, well, you're not going to believe it." "But no one can hear us now," I insisted. "We're alone out here in the dark. Most people are fast asleep by now. I don't want to go into the woods. It's so dark in there." Felix gave me one of his challenging looks, so I knew arguing with him was counterproductive, especially when he was like this. But going deep into the woods to get to the creek at this ungodly time of night seemed far too ambitious and like overkill to me. But there was no arguing with Felix, not when he was in this kind of a mood. Felix was holding a curious bundle of well-worn letters in his hand that were tied together with a black ribbon. I assumed the secret he had to share with me had something to do with these letters. Otherwise he wouldn't have brought them along with him. So naturally my inquisitiveness was aroused, but I said nothing as I patiently walked by Felix's side through the woods. We gingerly used the light of our torches to navigate our way cautiously through the tall, lofty trees. And despite the generous light that our torches exuded, it was bodefully inauspicious in the woods. I was experiencing what I can only describe as that insufferable, oppressive, suffocating feeling I always got when my parents nauseatingly began to ply me with hundreds of awkward questions, like they had done earlier on in the evening over dinner, when they demanded to know why I wasn't eating my food. When my parents behaved like this, all I wanted to do was to escape the stranglehold of their well-meaning interrogations. But right now, similarly, all I wanted to do was to flee the woodgrove and cycle straight back home as fast as I possibly could. I was terribly afraid to tell Felix how creeped out I actually was. Every creak from a branch that I heard, that moved in the slight breeze, or a rustle of leaves or hoot of an owl, made me jump out of my skin. I was terrified Felix would call me a wuss, or worse still, tell me that I was scared of encountering the ghost of Deirdre Horace wearing a nightdress covered in blood. The truth was, he'd have been right if he'd said that. I was absolutely petrified of seeing the ghost of Deirdre Horace. How could I admit that to Felix, who seemed incapable of experiencing fear of any kind? By all accounts, I was now a lot less interested in knowing about the secret that he had to convey to me. All I could think about was leaving the woodgrove. I was itching to go, because something just wasn't right, and a nasty chill had run down my spine, along with an ominous sense of foreboding that clung to my person like an overcoat that I couldn't shake off. Was it possible my current trepidation had something to do with the stories I'd heard about the ghost of Deirdre Horace? Perhaps the thought of her ghostly spectre haunting the woodgrove was clouding my sense of judgment and filling me with a paralysing fear, the likes of such I had never known before. Let's not kid, we all know the influences of such suggestible, haunting stories can be very disquieting, but I had never felt like this before, not a day in my life. My mother once told me a sad story about a poor man who was locked in a freezer unit at a restaurant kitchen and was desperately convinced he was going to freeze to death. He didn't realise that that particular freezer unit was a cool setting to preserve lettuce and vegetables, and he would never have frozen to death in that. But he was so convinced that he was going to die of the cold that scratches were found on the inside door of the freezer unit in his desperate attempts to escape what he believed would be a freezing incarceration. As a consequence of the crippling fear the man had subjected himself to, it would seem that he was found dead the following morning. Ostensibly the power of belief had brought on a mock hypothermia, and subsequently led to his untimely death. Was this happening to me, I wondered? Was my fierce belief in the paranormal inviting me to experience a heaped overload of frantic emotions that were bringing on a flight and fight response into every cell of my body? So I was rippled with an overwhelming sense of impending dread. How I held it together that night I do not know, but I fought those overwhelming desires to flee from the grove with all my strength and might, which did little to ease my frantic heartbeats that were pounding away so violently in the depths of my chest that I was almost certain that Felix would hear every drum and every beat that would automatically betray to him that I was exceedingly apprehensive. Why was I such a big baby, I asked myself, for I could see that Felix looked undisturbed, nonchalant, and as carefree as he always did, almost as if walking in the grove during the witching hour of the night like this was no skin off his nose. How I wished I could be like him, for Felix never entertained the alarming tale of Deirdre Horace with any credence at all. I glanced nervously over my shoulders at the footpath behind me to check that nothing was there. Why did I have this irksome feeling that something was following us, that something was behind me, that it was watching me, as if eyes were burning in the back of my neck? I hurriedly flashed my torchlight over the dark shadows to subdue them, in the hope that the light could swallow up any tenebrific images that had made me feel so jumpy. But nothing was there. I was beginning to feel a tad foolish. "There's no such thing as ghosts," I repeated in my mind. "There's no such thing as ghosts. There's no such thing as ghosts. There's no such thing as ghosts." I kept saying this to myself, like an ongoing mantra that they don't exist. They don't exist. They don't exist. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I was falling fast behind Felix. He was the one that appeared to be sashaying energetically through the woods, whereas I was literally crawling. I was so nervous. He turned around to look at me. There was an expression of annoyance dappling his forehead, as two great big furrows emerged between his brows, which made him look significantly older than his years. I knew we both had a birthday in common, as we were born on the same day, but truly I was beginning to feel as if I was a kid, and my salient, much wiser friend was the adult among the two of us. He seemed so unfazed by the dark shadows that loomed around us on this creepy, ill-omened night, that felt far more menacing the closer we got to the creek. "What's wrong with you, Barker? Why are you walking so slowly? You're lagging behind me," he said accusingly. "Hurry up, will you? We haven't got all night." "I'm not walking slowly. I'm walking carefully. It's very dark in here," I said defensively, trying to speed up my walk to meet up with Felix, but he was impossibly fast. There was a still breeze blowing among the trees. A few leaves were lifted up on the path and seemed to be flying around like celestial butterflies. It was not a particularly cold evening, but the breeze was significantly cool. And that was when I heard the voice. "Barker! Barker! Barker!" The voice appeared to wail, but it sounded distinctly like my mother. It couldn't be, I thought. It couldn't be. "Did you hear that?" I said, my voice unable to disguise the panic. "I didn't hear anything. What are you on about, Barker? Move on. We need to get walking. We need to get to the creek. You're walking too slowly." "But you must have heard that. Someone was calling my name. I think it was my mother." Felix looked at me as if I was completely mad. "What the hell are you talking about? No one is calling your name. It's all in your head." "But you must have heard it," I insisted. "It was probably the wind," said Felix, looking extremely irritated. "Get a move on, will you? We need to get to the creek." I was now wondering if I was going stark raving mad. I was sure I'd heard a voice calling my name that sounded ominously like my mother's voice, but I had to have been mistaken because Felix hadn't heard anything at all. I was now absolutely convinced that my treacherous mind was playing duplicitous tricks on me, and that my guileful thoughts were misleadingly leading me astray, like the poor man who ended up dying in the freezer unit at the restaurant. Finally, Felix and I reached the creek. Together we sat down on the bank, while Felix began to unravel the black ribbon that tied the collection of letters together. For a moment he was silent, as we listened to the gurgling sounds of the creek. We heard a hoot of an owl and a sudden flapping of wings, and in the distance the strangled cry of a coyote. Suddenly everything went so quiet, and even the crickets and frogs became mute. But I paid the silence no heed, as my attention was distracted to Felix, who had removed a letter from the bundle and was opening it up. I stared incredulously at the envelope, for the writing on it looked so familiar. The envelope had obviously been hand-delivered, because on the front were the words, "For the attention of Glenda Featherstone." Why did the writing look so familiar, I wondered, and then I realized it was my mother's writing. "What is it you want to tell me, Felix?" I asked, my eyes fixing on him. I knew whatever it was, it had something to do with the letter he was about to read to me, that was written in my mother's hand. Felix looked up at me soberly. "In these letters I've got some answers to many of the questions we've had over the years about our parents." "What kind of questions have we had over the years about our parents?" I asked Felix, not making any sense as to what on earth he was trying to say. Felix shrugged his shoulders rather nonchalantly and said, "Well, you know, we've often wondered why our parents live in each other's pockets. You have to admit that's strange. Why my mother and your mother are so incredibly close. I mean, they told us how they met at the hospital all those years ago when we were born. But I never believed the story for a second, because I'm not that gullible. I don't know about you. I always wondered why both our families spent weekends at each other's houses, why we live next door to each other, why we spend family vacations together, and why my mother every year buys you an excessively extravagant present, as expensive as the present she buys me. And your mother buys me a very expensive present, like she buys you. Now that's not normal behaviour, you have to admit it. Why would someone that's not biologically related to you, year after year, buy you a very expensive present? You do that with your own kids, but not with friends of the family, surely. I've never made any sense of those questions, until I found these letters, of course, and then everything made perfect sense to me." "The letters are from my mother to your mother," I said, more as a statement than a question. "That's right. The letters are to my mother, from your mother," said Felix. "I'm going to read you this one letter, because in it you're going to hear something that is going to blow your mind. And when I say blow your mind, I quite literally mean a rocket is going to go off in your head, as it did for me. So prepare for takeoff." "Where did you find the letters?" I asked curiously. Felix at least had the good grace to look a tad sheepish. "My mother has a bureau in her study. She keeps it locked all the time. She tells me she's got secrets in that bureau. She hasn't hidden that from me. She says I'm never allowed to go in there. And so what does that do? It makes me naturally curious. So one day I spied on her. I watched where she put the key to the bureau when she locked up. She didn't see me spying on her, but she had this little hole that she kept in the floorboards. There's a crack in there, and that's where she puts the key. So I sneaked in there, and I took the key out of the crack when she went out shopping. So that's when I entered the bureau and looked inside. I couldn't believe what I found. I knew in the letters was going to be a secret, but it was a bombshell when I read what it contained. I could hardly believe it." "But you shouldn't have done that, Felix. Your mum told you not to go near the bureau." "I don't care about that now. What I care about is what is in these letters, which I'm going to share with you now. Do me a favour, shine your torch onto the page so I can read it to you." I obediently shone my light onto the letter, and Felix read it out loud. "Dear Glenda, this has to be the hardest letter I've ever had to write in my entire life, and not a letter any mother should have to write to another mother. I cannot put into words how dreadfully sorry I am that you had to receive such devastating news that was as devastating to me as I'm sure it has been to you, and of course your husband Winston. I'm in no doubt that with your son Barker now 4 years old, that you have grown incredibly fond and very attached to the young man, as we have indeed likewise grown to adore our son Felix, who is a bundle of joy, and a very clever little guy, with, dare I say, an insatiable curiosity on him,
that never seems to be quenched, let me tell you. When I learnt the bitter, unpalatable truth that Felix was not my biological son, it tore my entire world apart, into shreds. There is no other way to describe it. Sometimes I think in life it's kinder not to know the bitter truth. The truth can sometimes be very, very cruel indeed. But now the cat is fully out of the bag. We have to deal with it in some way. We can't ignore what we know. When I heard the devastating news, I was furious. I couldn't believe such a dreadful blunder could have been allowed to happen like this in the very first place. My husband Axel comes from the Lundevall family line. Me and my husband have Nordic names. I'm Astrid, my husband is Axel, and we named our son Felix after his grandfather, which is a common name in Norway. Well, as you can imagine, our family is Nordic. The blonde hair and the blue eyes is so typical of my family line. Indeed, I know of no family member that has not been tall with blonde hair and blue eyes. When Felix was born, he appeared to be blonde and blue-eyed, but by the time he was 2, his blonde hair had all but vanished, disappeared, like a passing memory, and had mysteriously grown quite dark. And his blue eyes looked a lot more greenish than blue, which in my opinion was profoundly strange. My husband Axel asked if I'd been having an affair when I fell pregnant with Felix, only as a joke, as many of our extended family members started to comment rather regularly that Felix was unusually small for his age, as our family has always been particularly tall. Axel's mother even said that even at 2 Felix was uncommonly tiny for a Lundevall. Let's just say the dark hair was a first for the Lundevall family, along with the green eyes that were definitely blue when Felix was born. On a whim, my husband decided to clandestinely check our son's DNA. I think he did it more as a joke than anything else, to assure any questioning family members with lingering doubts that Felix was indeed our son. Not for a single second did Axel suspect remotely that Felix was not his son, but he did the test anyway. Axel was in a dreadful shock when it turned out from the DNA results that Axel was 99% not the father of little Felix. As you can imagine, this horrifying news hit my husband really hard. He was so gutted that Felix was not his biological son. Axel even wondered for a brief moment if I'd possibly cheated on him during our marriage. But he doubted that that was the case, as he knows all too well that I've never been the cheating type. I'm glad to say my husband gave me the benefit of the doubt on that one, but he still decided to surreptitiously get my DNA checked against Felix's. The results shocked and mystified Axel further when he discovered, paradoxically, that I was not Felix's biological mother. When I learnt the news, we both contacted the hospital to access the records of all babies born on the exact same day as Felix was. Initially, they were not very cooperative towards us, and insisted rather curtly that there was no way under any circumstances that we would have returned home with the wrong baby. So we got our attorney to deal with the hospital on this matter, and to access the records. We soon discovered that indeed another boy was born prematurely, at exactly the same time and at the same hospital as little Felix, and the woman who'd given birth to her son was called Glenda Featherstone. We managed to get further information about you from a private detective that we hired, called Mark Zuckerberg. I know it was wrong of Axel to surreptitiously take some of your son's DNA without your knowledge, but Axel actually felt it was the most ethical, sensitive, and emotionally kind thing to do for you in the circumstances. I know it sounds anything but. I guess he didn't want to tell you there was a possibility that your child may not be your biological kid, in case there was some oversight, and our assumptions were all wrong, as the last thing we'd want to do is to drag you into this tangled mess, if it could possibly be avoided. Axel found a baby's bottle with a dummy attached to it, lying in your outside bin, that had been thrown out because the side of the bottle appeared to have been cracked. Axel knew it must belong to your 4-year-old, as you did not have other children. So Axel managed to take a swab from it, and it matched our DNA. So we are definitely the parents of your little boy, Barker. The news was a shocker, let me tell you. Now we know for sure that your son Barker is our son, and your son Felix is ours. How do you deal with something like that? We've both been placed in an impossible position, which can only be described as a parent's most horrendous nightmare. You don't expect to return home from the hospital with the wrong baby, do you? I delivered prematurely, as so did you, due to complications, and premature babies look very alike, especially when they're tiny, I believe. When my baby was born, he was blue. We were so worried our baby was not going to survive, being so desperately underweight. We never really got to study our baby closely enough. He went straight to the incubator, you see. I understand from the hospital, if I'm getting this right, that both babies were born prematurely, within a minute of each other or so. They were taken together to the incubation facilities by 2 nurses. For some reason, the nurses got confused as to which baby was which, and electronically tagged them wrong. The problem with babies being so premature, as ours so obviously was, they look so alike at that age. I have spoken to our attorney. There is some legal action we can take against the hospital, but I'm sure as parents we both want to raise our real biological children, as we both intended on the day we left the hospital to begin our journeys as mothers. We never expected to be taking home a stranger's child, or to grow so attached to the child in question that we believed to be our own. None of this is remotely fair, and in the beginning, when I learnt the horrifying truth, I felt like this had to be some cruel, malicious joke. I'm not sure how you want to proceed from here. You're welcome to take as much time as you need to get your head around all this. I certainly needed plenty of time. The idea of giving up Felix is doing my head in, and maybe you would prefer it if we kept our non-biological children as our own. I would be happy to keep Felix, but I would also very much like to raise my own biological son. My husband Axel would like to do a swap, as he's insistent we should be raising our own children. We could, of course, go the legal route over this debacle, but I hatched up a plan of my own that might just work, provided you agree, of course. And if both families are on board with it, let me know what you think. It occurred to me, if we lived close to each other as families, our children could grow up together side by side, so that you could continue to be very much involved in Barker's life, as I could be involved in Felix's. We could do a straightforward swap that way, without involving the courts, and continue to be actively involved in each other's lives. So you can keep an eye on Barker from a healthy distance, and I can watch over Felix. It is inevitable, in the circumstances, that we will never stop loving each other's non-biological children, as we raised them for 4 years as our own, believing them to be our true children. So we're bonded with our kids. It's a significant amount of time, 4 years, to grow very attached to a child. On the brighter side of things, of course, if there is one in this huge, inexcusable debacle, I have persuaded myself that it could have been a whole lot worse for us if we'd found this out when the boys were a lot older. That would have been so much more traumatic, especially for our children. Luckily, our children are only 4 years old at this age, and as a result, they will have no memory of their early lives. If we agree to do this, we need never tell our children about this grievous mistake that was made by the hospital, as why would they need to know any of this at all? I'm not exactly sure how you will feel about my rather unorthodox idea, but if we are involved in each other's lives in this way, we will never have to let go of our non-biological children that we have grown to love as our own. When I learnt I might have to give Felix up, it hit me hard like a thunderbolt to the stomach. But at the same time, I also wanted to be raising my biological son, which is perfectly understandable. I think if we worked things out this way, we would be gaining and not losing. I know you need a lot of time to process what has happened. God knows I did. But when you and your husband Winston have discussed how you would like to proceed from here, please let us know. Kind regards, Astrid. Once my best friend Felix had finished reading the letter to me, written to his mother by my own mother, I was left completely speechless.
How did I react to a startling revelation like this? I wasn't certain, because although it was profoundly shocking, I really didn't feel personally affected by something I couldn't remember, as I had always been raised by what I believed were my real biological parents, even after the hospital debacle, as I had no memory of that event, or the first 4 years of my life for that matter. So it didn't hit me as hard as it probably should have done, but it was still quite the shocker to learn this outlandish news. But Felix was right. It did answer many questions for me. "I don't believe it," I said. "I was raised by your parents, who believed I was their son, until I was 4 years old. And you were raised by my parents, for they believed you were their son. From the sounds of things, my father thought it was very odd that your blonde hair turned dark, and of course that your eyes turned green and weren't blue anymore. So he surreptitiously did a DNA test and discovered to his shock and horror that you weren't actually his real son. So you ended up with the Norwegian name Felix, which was meant for me, and I was named Barker by your parents. I never understood why I had such a strange name that wasn't of Norwegian origin, and I thought it was peculiar still that my next-door neighbour had a Norwegian name, and I didn't, because my grandfather is called Felix. Now everything is falling into place. Everything is beginning to make sense, don't you think?" Felix nodded his head earnestly, in agreement. "It is super weird. I can't tell you how weird this is," said Felix. "Think about it. I was raised by your parents. You were raised by mine. But neither of us, because we were so small at the time, had any memory of what happened. Which has got to be a good thing if you think about it. Imagine how traumatizing it might have been for us if we had been a little older and had grown attached to each other's parents. But neither of us remember being 4 years old, so we don't actually feel any sense of loss, do we? It's like learning about someone in the family that you never knew, that died or something, but you don't feel sad about their loss because you have no memory of them." I thought about Felix's words carefully and said, "You know, that's a really good way to put it, Felix. It is rather like losing someone that is in your family, that they died suddenly, and everybody's sad about it, but you're not, because you never knew that person, so why would you be sad? We can't be sad because we don't remember being 4 years old. We don't remember being raised by each other's parents. So none of this matters to us. It probably only matters to our parents. But you know something, I always thought it was odd when we were born in the same hospital on the very same day, and that we were both premature babies. Our parents told us they met at the hospital, and that's where they became best friends. But that was a white lie, so that they could explain to us why we were born on the same day, I suppose, and why over the years we've had our birthday parties together. I had no idea that both our parents were sitting on such a dark secret that they have never shared with us. They clearly don't want us to know about it. But your mother, Glenda, has always been over-familiar and very adoring towards me, which always used to make me feel a little awkward at times, as other people's mothers are not like Glenda is towards me. But now it all makes perfect sense. The jigsaw puzzle finally fits together. My mother is still very maternal towards you, because she raised you as her son for 4 years. My mother is always speaking so warmly about you, Felix. She always says how wonderful you are, and she always boasts about everything that you do, and I've never understood that. It can't have been easy for our parents to give us up, but they must have agreed with my mother's plan. Otherwise we wouldn't be so involved in each other's lives like we so obviously are, would we? I'm glad that you and I have become like brothers. It's all worked out in the end absolutely perfectly. Because if you weren't in my life, Felix, I'd feel like an only son. But I've always felt I had a brother in you." Felix nodded his head in agreement, his face breaking out into a cheeky grin. "You've always been a brother to me. That's how I see you, Barker. You're my big brother, even though you were only born minutes before I was. I can't imagine not having you in my life. Nor could I ever imagine being called by your name. Barker would never suit me, but it sure does suit you. And I rather like my Norwegian name Felix, even though I'm not from Norway. I could never be a Barker. It's just so weird how things worked out in the end. We got the right names that suited us, even though they weren't meant for us in the first place. I can't imagine you not being in my life. And if we hadn't met, I'm not sure we'd have become friends, because we wouldn't have been brought together in the way we were. Maybe our parents really just think it's best we don't know about the hospital blunder made all those years ago. And I guess I can understand why they feel that way. But you're right, now I come to think of it. My mother has been so adoring to you over the years, while your mother's more reserved. But even so, she's always treated me with a special tenderness, your mother. We go on holidays together as families, don't we? It's almost like we live in each other's pockets. And now we know exactly why. Our families are entangled in each other's lives and have chosen to do this to watch us both grow up. Your mother is my mother's best friend, and your father's my dad's best friend. And I doubt any of that would have happened if they hadn't all met in such bizarre circumstances. But maybe it was meant to be. Everything just fits together perfectly now. How do you feel about this, Barker? Felix asked me. His eyes continued to fix on me steadily. You don't look at all shocked or confounded about this secret. I was expecting you to be so taken aback, so baffled. But you're taking it remarkably well, if you don't mind my saying so. Well, how do you expect me to react? I asked. Felix pulled a face. I thought you might let out a few rather explosive explanations that would emphasize your shock. But you've been uncharacteristically subdued about the letter that your mother wrote mine. Well, do you blame me for that? It just feels so surreal, I said. It's almost as if we're talking about somebody else and not about ourselves, don't you think? I feel quite detached about it all, really. As if the story had happened to somebody else and not to me. It's hard to digest. It doesn't feel real. I feel exactly the same, Felix admitted. It would seem after Felix had read my mother's letter that she had written Felix's mother all those years ago, that my fear about being in the woods on this dark, intimidating, oppressive night had momentarily been suppressed and rather escaped me, as I had tried to assimilate the information very slowly. I was genuinely surprised to find that I didn't have any strong feelings about the news either way. For a moment I was quiet, circumspect, and somewhat reflective, I have to admit, as I appreciatively listened to all the background sounds, especially the more prominent sound of the gurgling water, which was oddly comforting and reassuring. For some reason the sound of fast-moving water has always brought me a profound sense of peace, and it certainly did on this night. I could hear the sound of a distant owl, hooting further away in the woods. What should I be feeling, I wondered? If the truth be told, I felt rather blank about it all, like someone who's been asked to write a story by their teacher at school and can't put anything on the page. No creative thoughts, no insights, nothing comes to mind. It was not that I was an emotionless child by any manner of means, that didn't care, but it's hard to be hurt or offended by something you can't remember at all, especially when things turned out favourably in the end. Instead, all I really felt was pity for both of our parents, being put through such a grievous nightmare like this. But it had never affected the both of us in any way, so why should it unravel us? If you must know, I said, I can't believe it, but I'm not remotely upset about any of this, because I can't remember it happening at all. It's like someone telling me years later I was born with a club foot. Why would I care about such a thing if I have no memory of it? How could such news ever upset me? I mean, think about it. My father has a friend called Denzel. Denzel was born with one leg after his mother had a botched abortion procedure. It turns out Denzel was one of a twin. The gynecologist had failed to detect that there were twins. On the screen, of course. So Denzel's twin brother was ripped away, as was one of Denzel's legs. It was just sucked up. When, of course, Denzel's mother realised, much later on, that there was another baby growing in her womb, she decided to keep it. I asked Denzel if he was sad that he didn't have 2 legs. One of them had been lost, you see, in that procedure. He said he'd only ever had 1 leg, so he didn't miss the leg that he wasn't born with, because he was so used to only having 1 leg. But he was also glad to have survived that botched abortion. And the only thing he said was that he was sad about losing his twin. Well, that is a horrible story, Barker. Goodness gracious, that really is horrible. But you're right. You don't grieve over something you never knew you had. We both have no memory of being raised by different parents. So why would we be sad about any of it? And now we have each other. So good came of it all in the end. That's my point, I said. What were you feeling, Felix? I asked him, when you first read the letter that my mother wrote yours. How did you react to it? Well, of course I was shocked, said Felix. Who wouldn't be? In the beginning, I was shaking like a leaf. I wasn't nearly as calm as you've been, because I knew I'd stumbled on a big secret. I suppose I felt guilty for prying in my mother's business. I guess I felt more sorry for both of our parents than for us. As you were saying, we haven't been affected by this. We didn't know any better. But I guess for our parents it was traumatic to give up the child that they believed was their own, for the child that really was theirs. It has not bothered me at all, any more than it doesn't bother you. We have no memory of being raised by each other's parents, do we? What I do remember, though, is your family always being very involved in my life, and our families always being extremely close. I never understood the dynamics of what was really going on there, but I didn't suspect a thing, nor did I find it profoundly strange. I mean, we live next door to each other. We're like brothers, so in my opinion, as I keep saying, things worked out great in the end. And I would suspect our parents probably think so too. The swap must have happened when we were only 4 years old, and it was only our parents that suffered because of it. All these other letters talk about the swap, but I'm not going to read them to you now. They're very emotional. They're written between 2 women who are clearly distraught and very sad. If that's the case, I don't want to hear them, I said. You better put those letters back in the bureau where you found them, Felix, before your mum realises that they're missing, because she'll do her nut if she finds they're gone, especially if she realises her secret's out. I know how pedantic your mother can be. That's exactly what I'm going to do. You don't think we should say anything to our families, do you, Barker? Like we know what's happened to us all those years ago? Felix asked me cautiously. Should we confront them, I mean? What do you think? No, I said insistently. You don't want to tell them we know their secret. Are you crazy? For a start, your mother will know you've been snooping around in her private bureau, and that will make her mad as a hatter. And secondly, if our parents wanted us to know what happened to us all those years ago, they'd likely tell us themselves, would they not? But they clearly do not want to tell us their secret. Maybe they don't want to be reminded of what happened back then, because it might bring up some raw, hurtful emotions that they don't want to entertain. And maybe they think we're better off in the long run not knowing about the hospital debacle that occurred in the first 4 years of our lives. It probably doesn't matter anyway. It's history, isn't it? You're right, Felix agreed. We must never talk about this to anyone. It's got to stay a secret. My lips are sealed, he said, making a ziplock motion across his lips. To tell you the truth, I'm not sure how long our discussion lasted, but it was for quite a long time, I suspect. But then all of a sudden, against the gurgling sound of the water, I suddenly heard my mother's voice calling my name, and Felix likewise heard his mother calling his name. Felix's face went white. All the colour drained away from his skin, as Glenda Featherstone's voice called out, "Felix! Felix! Where are you, Felix? Felix!" Followed by my mother Astrid,
who was also calling out my name. "Barker! Barker! Where are you?"
"What have you done?" said Felix, looking at me incredulously. I could swear he almost growled at me. He was so indignant. "I told you to be quiet when you left your house, but you couldn't do it, could you? You had to make a big noise. Your mother likely saw you leave the house in the middle of the night and guessed we were meeting up. She looked at your cell phone and realized we'd gone into the woods together. Now your mother has gone and contacted my mother, and they're looking for us in here. This is an absolute disaster. They know we're here. If our mothers have read our messages, they'll demand to know what our secret is." I trembled nervously and failed to answer Felix's question, as I was equally as terrified about how my mother was going to react, knowing I'd crept out during the night like this to meet up with Felix. We both had left our cell phones behind and had not deleted our previous messages to each other. And if my mother had read the message, she would go ballistic. I was in no doubt about that. She was already far too overprotective towards me in the first place. I could feel my heart thundering violently in my chest, with a fear that was palpable, as our mothers continued to call out our names. I had never felt so affrighted in my whole life, as I knew Felix and I would be in serious trouble once we were confronted by our outraged mothers, who would be less than amused by our antics and nocturnal activities that evening. It was so unsettling in the woodgrove. It was like the trees were conspiring against us and surrounding us like a herd of very incensed cows, and all I wanted to do was escape. But I knew we had to respond to our parents' voices. The game was up. They knew exactly where we were, so there was no point in hiding. Whether we liked it or not, we had to face the music. I quickly decided I'd tell my mother that the secret was about the ghost of Deirdre Horace, that Felix and I had come into the woods to see if we could spot her ghostly apparition at the dead of night. It seemed like a good story to make up to me, a reasonable excuse to make. Our mothers were calling out our names, with a notable panic to their voices. I certainly could tell by the indignant tone of my mother's voice that we were in for a huge telling off. I suspected for the next month or so. Both me and Felix would have our pocket money confiscated, and of course I wouldn't hear the end of it from my mother, about how I should have known better, and going into the woods in the middle of the night was a fool's folly. My mother called out, "Barker! I know you're in here! Now show yourself!" And Felix's mother was calling after Felix, but her tone of voice was more hysterical. But then again, Glenda Featherstone by nature was perennially rather neurotic. "Coming, Mum!" I called out. "Felix and I are here! We're coming!" Felix and I, I'm afraid, with our tails between our legs, very nervously, walked towards the voices, expecting, of course, to encounter our mothers, standing together side by side, looking at us through eyes burning with fire. We braced ourselves for the impact of the huge telling off we were about to receive. I was inwardly cursing myself for being so noisy when I'd left the house. I had tried my level best to be as quiet as I possibly could, but obviously I had not been discreet enough, and it was because of me that Felix and I had landed in deep trouble. I had made absolutely sure when I left the bicycle shed, as noisy as it was, that my parents' bedroom light hadn't suddenly gone on. I was certain I hadn't woken up my mother, but obviously I had. She was an annoyingly light sleeper. Suddenly we saw it, and nothing prepared me or Felix for what we were about to encounter, for we had never seen anything like this before in our entire lives, and even in our wildest, most indulgent of imaginations, neither of us would ever have been creative enough to dream up something like this. But there was no doubt this thing was very real. But what the hell was it? My blood that was coursing through my veins went an icy cold, because this was the most diabolical thing I'd ever beheld, that looked to be something that the bowels of hell itself had vomited out into our universe. You would think that my legs would gain some kind of a momentum, an obedient bounce or a spring, so that driven by natural instincts and a surge of adrenaline, I'd be propelled out of the woodgrove at the speed of a rocket. But no such luck. My useless, unobliging legs had become like jello beneath me. My ice-blue eyes were virtually popping and bulging out of their sockets, rather like that of an insect. I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat, blasting violently through my chest, like an over-enthusiastic orchestra of heavy metal music. Every beat was insufferably deafening. I could feel my throat had grown as dry and parched as an arid desert. My eyes began to burn, sting, and tear up, almost as if someone had thrown acid in my face. I knew the tearing up in my eyes and the burning in my nostrils was due to the ungodly stench that sucked all the oxygen out of the air and filled the woodgrove with the suffocating smell of death and decay that was overbearing in every sense of the word. I cannot describe this foul scent to you, but it was a hideous cocktail of burning sulphur and rotting flesh, as if this thing standing before us, although alive, was actually dead, and the flesh hanging over its emaciated bones was hideously grotesque and repugnant. I have never seen anything so vile and ugly before, until I encountered this vile-looking beast, and then I understood the meaning of the word. Felix told me that from the moment he saw this thing, every single cell in his body crawled in abject terror, and he felt his muscles stiffen, and his racing heart began to feel as if piercing sharp needles were being injected in his chest over and over again, which made it hurt very badly for him when he tried to draw in any breath. Whatever this thing was, it had a malevolent, duplicitous power over us. We had become helpless to defend ourselves against it, but the curious thing was that the creature knew things about us that it couldn't possibly have known, which for me was the scariest thing of all. This grotesque thing seemed to be smiling at us maliciously, giving us the most malignant grin I've ever seen in my life. And as it did so, it continued calling our names out in our mother's voices, so that as he spoke, we found ourselves being drawn towards him, like two innocent lambs to the slaughter. We couldn't stop ourselves. Felix told me he tried to run away, tried to resist this indomitable hold the creature had over us. But it was impossible to resist him, and Felix said his legs became incapacitated, refusing to move. He was like a car that had run out of all its gas, and his body felt as if it was so heavy he could barely move. So his experience was not unsimilar to my own. There is no doubt in my mind that this thing possessed some kind of ungodly, paradoxical, hypnotic hold over us, making us like sitting ducks to its insidiously guileful intentions. What the hell is it? The creature was tall and skeletal. It had a humanoid-like torso, pointed ears and antlers on its human-like head. It had a hairless body, was emaciated and exceedingly gaunt, with gnarled bones that protruded very graphically through its tautly, very grey-greenish-coloured skin. The demonical eyes of the creature were set deep back in its sockets, giving off a red eye-shine. It possessed long bent legs and even longer arms with human-like hands that had the sharpest claws I've ever beheld, easily over a foot long without exaggeration, and those claws are capable of doing a hell of a lot of damage. When it smiled at us, its mouth was filled with jagged yellow fang-like teeth, which were incredibly sharp, while its quivering lips were flecked with blood, almost as if it had just been eating something, but was still ravenously hungry. It was looking at us with a hungry enthusiasm, which left me in no doubt what it wanted from us. This thing wanted to eat us, and of that I was in no doubt. But how could we escape it, when we were drawn towards it like iron filings to a magnet, almost as if an invisible force was drawing us right into the lion's den? The creature kept using our mother's voices to manipulate us. First it called out Felix's name. "Felix! Felix! Felix! Oh, there you are, Felix! Why don't you come here, my boy? Come here, won't you? Mummy wants to give you a big hug. Yes, Mummy wants to give you a big hug. You've been a naughty boy, haven't you? Coming into the woods at this late time of night. Never mind, I'll overlook it just this once." Then in the same breath he began to call out my name in my mother's voice. "Oh, there you are, Buck. Oh, dear me. Why didn't you come when I called you? You look white, my boy, so very white.
Since when have you been afraid of your own mother?" the creature said, with its long fingers pulling us towards it. "You're not my mother," I cried out. "Stop pretending to be her. Go away, will you? Leave us alone. Go away. We don't want you coming near us. Leave us alone." The creature began to cackle like a witch. "You were so easily duped, the both of you," it said in my mother's voice. "Were you not? Now you're both mine." "Go away," I cried out. "Leave us alone." But the more I tried to resist the creature, the stronger the forceful hold it seemed to have over us. And, of course, Felix was equally as vulnerable to it. It was as if it was directing our movements with a fine string, like a puppeteer, a master puppeteer at that, when he does that with a puppet. I had a profound sense that this thing was going to do more than consume us, almost as if it wanted our very souls. I continued to battle with all my might, both emotionally and physically, but it was useless because I was powerless to fight against its all-consuming hold it appeared to have over us. I was convinced that both Felix and I were not going to make it out of the woods alive. This thing was going to devour us. A little voice deep down in my gut cried out, "God, please help! Please!" came the little voice. "Please save us!" Just as I was crying out to my Maker, at that precise moment, I heard gunshots. The creature that had assumed control over us quickly retreated, as if the gunshots themselves had broken the spell he had over us. Who had fired the gunshots, I wondered, turning around to look behind me, and that was when I saw Ian Fierceling, the reclusive man who lived in the house that overlooked the woods. He stood there with a rifle in his hands. He fired off a few more shots after the creature, and then the creature was all but gone from our sight. I was so very relieved to see Ian Fierceling, as I unequivocally knew he had saved our lives that night. Tears were stinging in my eyes, sliding down my cheeks unabashedly. I was taking in big, grateful gulps of fresh air, almost as if I had been deprived of oxygen for far too long. As when the creature retreated, so did the hideous smell of death and decay, and at last I could breathe again. Ian Fierceling did not look best pleased with us.
"What the hell are you two kids doing out here in the middle of the night like this?"
he asked us pointedly.
"You should not be in the woods. Do your parents even know you're out here?" "Silly me, that was a stupid question to ask, wasn't it?" he said, without expecting an answer from us. "Of course they don't know, do they? Do you kids realize that there are unspeakable things in these woods? You boys should know better about that. If I hadn't rescued you both in time, I dread to think what would have become of you. That thing that was pretending to be your mother's had full control over you. But then I'm sure you know that already. You were in grave danger, let me tell you."
I didn't answer Mr. Fierceling's formal question of what we'd been doing in the woods in the middle of the night. I guess he knew kids got up to all kinds of nonsense, and he probably wasn't much different to us at our age anyway. Instead, I said, "Mr. Fierceling, what was that thing?" I was stumbling awkwardly over my words, as I remained shell-shocked, but I noticed Felix wasn't doing much better. Normally he was so much braver and more courageous than I was, but he'd become a ghostly white colour. His eyes were as wide as saucers, and for a moment it seemed as if his ability to speak had cruelly abandoned him, as if his tongue had been tied. Finally his words broke through the stiff silence. "Mr. Fierceling," he stammered. What? But he failed to complete his sentence, for his whole body was shaking like a leaf. It was the first time in my entire life that I'd seen Felix looking so afraid. He was human after all, it would seem. Mr. Fierceling was still angry. His whole body appeared to be jiggling with indignation. His eyes were almost standing up on stalks, for he too had witnessed the treacherously malignant creature who had held us to ransom.
"You want to know what that thing was? That was the Wendigo."
"The Wendigo? What is that?" I asked.
"The word Wendigo means an evil that devours. You boys are very lucky I spotted your bicycles along the footpath, or I would not have known you were messing around in the woods. I had a nasty feeling you were going to encounter the Wendigo if you were in the woods at this time of night, for the Wendigo has been wandering these woods for generations, and one thing you need to know about a Wendigo is no matter how much they have consumed, they remain ravenously hungry, with an insatiable appetite that cannot be satisfied. So the two of you were fair game for the creature. If I hadn't come along, I dread to think what would have become of the both of you. The Wendigo has taken out more people than you can ever imagine, who have simply disappeared off the face of this earth, never to be seen or heard from again. And people are left bereft, wondering what had become of these missing people. You, too, could have ended up as a missing person statistic. Children that vanished, never to be seen again. You should know better than to go wandering around the woods at this ungodly time of night. People have reported all kinds of strange sightings in here. Peculiar phenomenon, you could say. Lights and things like that. Let me tell you, I've seen things in these woods you do not even want to know about or entertain. The portal in the woods opens at night, and things are allowed to come through our reality. And not all of them are good, I'm afraid to say.
Mr. Fierceling, I don't know how to thank you for saving us, I said. I really don't know what to say. I'm just so grateful you were up at this time of night. If you hadn't come along, This thing, said Felix, interjecting, as he interrupted me. I've heard of the Wendigo, Mr. Fierceling, before, but I thought it was an Indian legend. I didn't think it was real. But now I know it is. Nobody told me it was real, he said, looking quite peeved, because he thought the Wendigo was a legend, when it was anything but.
You didn't think it was real? Well, you're not alone, young man. Many people do not believe the Wendigo is real. They believe it's all legendary. People can be so desperately naive. Or maybe it's comfortable for them to believe that things like this do not exist in our reality. But if they knew the truth, they may not actually sleep very well at night in their beds, said Ian Fierceling, shaking his head furiously. When you hear of legends, you know one thing, that there is truth behind those stories. There always is. There is no doubt about it. The indigenous people of the Americas didn't just make these things up just for a joke or for fun. They saw things. They talked about them to their people. And those stories passed down through the generations and became legends. Even the Bible tells us. It warns us that we wage war not only against flesh and blood, but against spiritual beings and principalities of evil in high places. The entity you have seen comes from the pits of hell itself, and of that I am most sure. Sometimes these creatures get caught up in the fabric of our world, and the Wendigo roams these woods at the dead of night, and has been coming through that open portal, and when he does, he's always got a raging appetite on him that can never be satisfied. I have heard the Wendigo calling my own name, with the voice of my deceased father. The creature has a profound knowledge of every one of us, like evil spirits genuinely do. He knows how to mimic the people we love, so we will be surreptitiously lured into his deadly trap. And once we are ensnared, I'm afraid there is no escape for us.
I know, I said. The Wendigo, it was calling us, Mr. Fierceling, with the voices of our mothers. But then you know that. We thought our mothers had found out that we were messing around in the woods, and that we had left our houses in the middle of the night, because we knew that if they knew we'd got out and were out here on our own, we'd be in big trouble. You won't tell our parents, will you, Mr. Fierceling?
I shan't be telling your parents anything, young man. You need not worry about that. But make absolutely sure the two of you don't come to the woods at night. During the day, it's a different matter altogether. It's perfectly safe, as the portal is closed. But at night, this place becomes a completely different world. Everything shifts. You can feel it in the atmosphere and the energy around you, closing in on you on every side, and it can be insufferable at the best of times. I've been in these woods on many a night, and I've seen things that you would not believe.
Mr. Fierceling, my mother told me you'd seen the ghost of Deirdre Horace. Is that true? My mother doesn't believe ghosts are real, but I do, Mr. Fierceling.
Word gets around fast in a place like this, does it not?
Said Ian Fierceling.
It seems to me, young man, that you've got a wise head on those young shoulders of yours. Of course ghosts are real. Of course they exist. I remember the night you talk about very well, and seeing the woman in grave distress. She was wearing a nightdress, covered in blood. She looked incredibly real, and for a moment I believed she was. That's why I called the police. But to answer your question, ghosts are real, and the ghost of Deirdre Horace does wander the woods many a night. Maybe she comes through that portal. I cannot be sure, but I don't think she even knows that she's dead.
Mr. Fierceling wiped away the sweat that had gathered from his forehead with a handkerchief that he'd pulled out from the pocket of his chinos.
This place is so damn oppressive at night, he said. I don't want to sound like a broken record and keep repeating myself over and over again, but sometimes it's important to do so, to make your message very clear. And I can't tell you children enough that you mustn't come into the woods at night ever again. There are ungodly, unspeakable things around here that you children know nothing about. They would rip you to shreds if given the chance. There are beings like the Wendigo. The Wendigo isn't exclusive, you know. There are others even worse than him. That portal, when it is open, it is very dangerous. And now that you've encountered the Wendigo, the threats on your life are not over yet. You need to be extremely careful, very vigilant.
What do you mean? The threats to our lives are not over, Mr. Fierceling. You saved us, did you not? And we won't be coming back into the woods at night. So we will be all right, won't we?
The Wendigo has mysterious powers that you know nothing about, said Mr. Fierceling. He can intercept your dreams at night and put you into a trance-like state when you're fast asleep, so that unbeknown to you, you can be drawn to the woodgrove without being consciously aware of what you're doing. The creature has an insatiable appetite, as I keep telling you. He's not going to give up on the both of you, just because I scared him away. He will try again to lure you back into the woods, so you will be drawn into his duplicitous trap, in a sleep-induced state, I expect. So you will be helpless to fight against him, if you are not conscious of what you are doing.
So what are we going to do? What do you mean, Mr. Fierceling? I asked, my eyes widening in terror. Are you saying the Wendigo is going to draw us out of our beds in the middle of the night, right back into the woods? So we're back where we started?
That's exactly what I'm saying. But I have a plan. I need the two of you to be here at midnight tomorrow. I will meet you outside my house. Just knock on the front door. There is someone I know who will be able to help you overcome this very sizable threat. Now off with you, young men, and don't go into the woods at night again, if you know what's good for you.
The following morning I was exceedingly grateful that it was a Saturday. I was absolutely exhausted, as you can imagine, and still in a state of disbelief about the paradoxical, intrepid adventure the previous night had bestowed on us, that in the cold light of day seemed almost impossible to actually believe. I reminded myself that Felix and I had encountered the Wendigo last night. What might have become of us, I wondered, had Ian Fierceling not come to our aid, and knowing what the worst outcome might possibly have been, sent shivers of dread down my spine. I still felt as if everything that had transpired had all been a horrifying nightmare. But as I glanced down at my filthy clothes that I was still wearing from the previous night, that were covered with muddy patches, I knew with absolute certainty that the previous night's activities had not been fictitious by any manner of means. I also noticed I had brought in with me a huge trail of leaves that were scattered liberally around the bedroom floor. And if that wasn't bad enough, there were dirt marks and smudges all across the window. This was the tangible evidence needed to confirm to myself that last night had indeed been real. How I wished it was all a lucid dream on my part, because I would have been happier to ignorantly believe that creatures like the Wendigo did not exist in our reality. But now I knew differently. I was glad for the reprieve the weekends brought, which meant that I didn't have to go to school on this day. My mother entered the bedroom later that morning, after I once again had slipped off into a deep sleep, for getting out of my cosy bed after a hellish night had been close to impossible. My mother was now seated at the end of my bed, so the springs bounced as she sat down, and that brought me out of my slumber. I sat up warily, letting out a substantial groan. My mother stared at me. There was a worried expression written all over her face, but her eyes immediately lit up when I looked at her through somewhat groggy but sleepy eyes. "What time is it?" I asked. "It's almost lunchtime, love." "That's really late," I said, looking rather bemused. "Yes, it is very late, Barker. This is a first for you, is it not? Sleeping in so late, I mean. I didn't want to wake you up. You were dead to the world. Anyone would have thought you were up and about all night. For you to be so obviously exhausted. I'm really worried about you, love," she said gingerly. "You would tell me and your father if there was something wrong, wouldn't you? It's not like you to sleep in this late, even if it is a Saturday morning. Should I be calling a doctor for you?" she asked. "Are you coming down with something, perhaps? Even in summer it's possible to catch a cold, you know." I wiped away the sleepy debris from my eyes and groaned. "I'm fine, Mum. Quit worrying about me, will you?" "That's just it, love. I'm not sure you are fine. I might remind you that you barely ate your dinner last night. You missed breakfast this morning and slept like an absolute baby, and would have continued to do so if I had not decided to wake you up right now, I'm most sure. Felix came around to the house earlier on his bicycle. He wanted to see you, you know. He seemed very eager to speak to you, but I told him you were sleeping, and he told me not to wake you up. He told me that when you woke up that he wanted you to message him right away on your cell phone." "But why didn't you wake me up when he came around?" I asked indignantly, unable to disguise the annoyance in my voice. "Because, love, I figured if you were sleeping in so late that your body must be craving the sleep. Our bodies are very clever, you know. They tell us when we need more rest, and we need to listen to that advice. For some reason your body is craving sleep. Maybe at the very least your immune system is fighting off the bug and is slightly compromised, which would explain the need for you to get more rest." "I'm hungry," I said to my mother. "My stomach is rumbling," I said, rubbing my stomach. My mother's face immediately brightened. Anyone would think I'd told her she'd won $1 million on the state lottery. She looked that pleased. "Oh, that is such a relief to hear you say that, Barker. If you're hungry, then you're back to your good old self again, and that is good news indeed. Get dressed, will you? Goodness gracious me! You're wearing yesterday's clothes. You didn't even bother to get into your pajamas last night." "Never mind. You boys will be boys at times, and I just have to accept that. Now get up. Wash your hands and brush your teeth, and I'll fix you something for lunch. Goodness gracious me! What on earth has gone on with your bedroom? It's covered with leaves. Where did they come from?" she asked me curiously. I was inwardly praying that she wouldn't see all the mess and the smudges around my window pane, but she didn't look at the window, which was a huge relief. "I think the leaves blew in the window last night. I left the window open, you see. There was quite a wind blowing outside." My mother looked momentarily bemused. "A wind? Last night? Goodness gracious me, I had no idea. I'm such a light sleeper. You'd think I would have heard something like that. Never mind. She blew me a kiss and whispered, "See you in a minute, love." I watched her leaving the bedroom behind, quietly closing the door, and I realized in that quintessential moment how much I deeply loved both of my parents, and how very glad I was that the swap had been made all those years ago, when I had been a 4-year-old boy, as now I was living with my biological parents, and it was always meant to be that way. And yet, in the grand scheme of things, everything like that seemed so minuscule compared to the monumental reality that both me and Felix had come face to face with the Wendigo last night, and I never wanted to see that hideous thing ever again, as long as I lived. I picked up my cell phone from the nightstand and began to text a message to Felix, hoping that he would respond as soon as possible. "Did last night really happen?" I asked him. "Or am I waking up from a horrible nightmare? Please tell me I'm waking up from a horrible nightmare. But the evidence says differently. There are leaves all over my bedroom, and I'm wearing yesterday's clothes, and they're covered with dirt. So I'm inclined to believe that last night really happened. But you'll make me feel very relieved if you tell me otherwise." Felix's reply was prompt. "Last night really happened. Remember the letters from your mother to mine? That was no dream. You and I were raised by the wrong parents for 4 years of our lives. And yes, we did see the Wendigo in the woods last night, calling us with our mother's voices. And yes, Ian Fierceling came to our rescue and fired a few shots after the thing. So yes, it was a nightmare, but a real one at that. I'm sorry to tell you that, bro. It was not fictitious. I came by your house earlier on. Your mum said you were dead to the world. I couldn't believe you managed to get to sleep after the events of last night. That thing we saw has haunted me the entire morning." I stared at Felix's message incredulously, digesting the horrifying truth of what had happened the previous night. For the strange paradoxical course of events that had unravelled in the woods seemed so surreal to me. Looking back, I really believe encountering the ghost of Deirdre Horace would have been a walk in the park compared to what Felix and I experienced with the Wendigo. I couldn't believe that such a horrific creature like this could actually exist in our reality. But Ian Fierceling impassionately believed that there was a portal in our woods that would open up at night, allowing these monstrous creatures to slip into our reality. As I thought about the monaciously demonical creature and its blazing red eyes that burned through us like a laser beam, and its hideous grotesque-looking face, and mouth full of yellow fang-like teeth that were mocking us as it spoke to us in our mother's voices, I shivered with dread. I remembered how both Felix and I had helplessly been drawn towards the Wendigo, almost as if it had some kind of dominant, forceful hold over us that we were powerless to resist. I couldn't imagine what would have happened to us had Ian Fierceling not come to our rescue. I very much doubted that we would still be here if it weren't for him. Then I remembered his ominous words that he had spoken last night. He was saying the threat the Wendigo imposed was still over us, and that we were still in mortal danger of the creature. So I hurriedly texted back Felix. "I'm so glad Ian Fierceling came to our rescue," I wrote. "If it wasn't for him, I dread to think—" I didn't finish the sentence, of course, for Felix would know exactly what I meant, and sometimes, in my experience, less words can say so much. "You're dead right about that, bro," came the swift reply. "You heard what Mr. Fierceling said. We're still in mortal danger. He said the Wendigo could easily drag us out of our beds in the middle of the night while we were dreaming, and we wouldn't even know about it. It would be like we would sleepwalk into the woods and be unconscious of all our actions. I can't believe, well, actually I can believe that the Wendigo is capable of doing all this. It obviously has supernatural powers. We need to go to Ian Fierceling's house tonight. He's got a plan to help us, if you remember. So you need to be there. I'll see you there at 12 tonight. Ian Fierceling says there's someone he needs us to meet who can help us. Maybe it's someone who knows a lot about how to outsmart the Wendigo. I can only hope so. See you then," came my prompt response. "Oh, there you are, Barker," said my mother, as I entered the kitchen.
I've made you a brunch, given you missed breakfast, and it's now lunchtime, and I can see you're starving hungry.
Mum, you're an absolute gem, I said, staring down enthusiastically at the plate full of pancakes, bacon, eggs, hash brown and sausages. My mother didn't say a word, but she sat down opposite me at the kitchen table, watching me wolf down every single mouthful until I'd cleaned up my plate. "Oh," she said, sighing with abject relief, once I'd scraped my plate completely clean.
"I'm so glad to see you eating again, love. I was so worried about your poor flailing appetite last night. You'd think I'd be pleased, wouldn't you, that you're eating less? For it saves on the grocery bills. But no, I wasn't pleased at all. When you don't eat, it's so unlike you that I worry. It's out of character for you to have a pitiful appetite. Your father, of course, said I was overreacting to worry about you so much. But I reminded him that you're growing up. You normally have such a hearty appetite, don't you? So it isn't like you not to eat. And in the last day or so, you've looked decidedly peaky, if you don't mind my saying so, love. And you've seemed somewhat distracted, almost as if your mind is a million miles away. But looking at you now, I feel a whole lot better about you, because the colour's come back to your face."
"Ma'am," I said, looking up at her in earnest, "do you believe in the Wendigo?" The words popped out of my mouth before I had a chance to rein them in, and I regretted even asking my mother this question, for it was a stupid question to ask someone like my mother, who was naturally cynical by nature, especially about anything cryptic or paranormal. My mother let out a chuckle.
"You know something, Barker. You do sometimes ask not only the funniest, but the most unorthodox questions. You know me. I've never been superstitious by nature. What on earth made you think of the Wendigo of all things, for goodness sake? I haven't heard that word mentioned for a long time. But believe it or not, my good old father believed in the Wendigo."
"He did?" I asked, my face lighting up.
"Yes, he did," said my mother, rolling her eyes in exasperation, as if she thought the very idea was pathetic. "I mean, have you ever? Everybody knows the Wendigo is just an ancient legend, a fictitious creature of sorts. But you know your grandfather. He was very insistent about those things, claiming they were definitely real, and that there was nothing legendary about them at all. But if you ask me, he was talking absolute nonsense. But why are you asking me all these questions, love? What's made you think about the Wendigo?"
"Oh, it's nothing," I said, shrugging my shoulders nonchalantly, and deciding to cut the conversation off as quickly as I could. There was no point in talking to my mother about a subject she obviously did not believe in. But I was very pleased to learn that my grandfather had not doubted that the Wendigo existed, and my grandfather was one of the shrewdest and wisest people I have ever known. It was at 10 to 12 that night that my cell phone began to bleep, and I was awoken from a rather restless sleep by the sound of my alarm going off. I had gone to bed that night in my clothes so that I wouldn't have to change. It had been a fitful night's sleep, for I was absolutely terrified that the moment I actually drifted off, the Wendigo would gain some kind of supernatural power over my unconscious dreamy state and lure me out into the woods. I was sure that Felix's sleep was equally as disruptful. I went through the same routine as I had done the previous night, trying my utmost to be as quiet as I possibly could, so as not to arouse the attention of my parents, who had gone to bed later that evening, so they might be even more inclined to hear any disruptive noises that I might potentially make, so I needed to be extremely vigilant. I was glad the house was steeped in a serene, very calm silence, which meant that maybe my parents had drifted off to sleep after all. I managed to squeeze myself through the window of my bedroom, with a few twists and turns, my sneakers finally hitting the wet, dewy grass on the other side. Then, with my torchlight in my hands, I made my way to the yard shed, drawing an inwardly nervous breath, as I knew once again, when I opened the shed door to retrieve my bicycle, that the shed door would not be cooperative on my account. It seems I was not wrong about that. The annoying door shrieked loudly as I pushed it open. My heart began to pound vigorously in my chest. As let's not kid, I was absolutely terrified that if I made the slightest noise that I would arouse my parents, and this was a night I could ill afford their attention. It was so important for me and Felix to meet up with Ian Fierceling so that he could help protect us against the Wendigo. I quickly removed my bicycle from the shed, my eyes pinned on my parents' bedroom. If a light went on in their bedroom, I knew my cover was immediately blown. But thank goodness nothing happened. The house and the bedroom were left in darkness. I gingerly dragged my bicycle very cautiously to the end of our driveway, taking fastidious care not to make a single sound. I then cautiously mounted my bike, cycling very nervously past the houses in our street, until I reached the cul-de-sac facing the woodgrove, where Felix was once again waiting for me rather impatiently outside Mr. Fierceling's property. We placed our bicycles against a tree there, and then walked across the front yard. It only boasted a few trimmed hedges and several scant-looking trees. Finally we came to the rather scratched-up front door. At a glance, Ian Fierceling's property, or bungalow so to speak, really did look rather run down and sad, almost as if it was begging someone to give it a much-needed facelift. I rather suspected Ian Fierceling probably didn't have the money to make the necessary improvements to his home, for he came across to me from our previous night's rendezvous as quite a fastidious person. The night was inauspicious. It was dark and clammy. The moon had become shadowy, as it was ambiguously covered by thick foggy cloud cover, and seemed somehow reticently reluctant to cast any light upon us, and even the usual twinkling stars were obscured from our sight, almost as if a seamstress had sewn the glistening diamante jewels on the inside of a black jacket, and not on the outside, so they were pretty much close to invisible. I was glad to see there was a light on in Ian Fierceling's house, so I assumed he was waiting up for us, which was a relief. My heart was weighed down, it was that heavy, as I hated being out here at the dead of night, given what me and Felix had gone through the previous night with the Wendigo. It would seem the shocking secret we had discovered about our parents going home with the wrong child after we were born seemed like water off a duck's back to us, compared to our encounter with the Wendigo, which had shaken us up to the core and shattered our view of reality so substantially that we were seeing the world through a completely different lens now. I thought about my mother's reaction at lunchtime when I asked her about the Wendigo. She seemed to think my grandfather was an old fool to believe in a legend such as the Wendigo, but she was poking fun at something she would never understand or appreciate, unless of course she happened to lay her eyes on the Wendigo itself, much like we had done, for we knew we would never be the same after this experience. I also knew if Felix and I did not get the help we needed right away, that the Wendigo imposed a very real threat to our lives. I could only hope with all my heart and soul that Ian Fierceling knew what he was doing, and could give us the safeguards we obviously needed to ensure that the Wendigo left us alone and no longer imposed a threat to us. "Oh, I'm so relieved to see you, Barker. You have no idea. I had such a horrible dream just now, before we got here. I can't believe I even managed to get to sleep. I didn't want to get any sleep at all, because I was so afraid that the moment that I fell asleep, that Wendigo would be after me and drag me into the woods. I was terrified, Barker, let me tell you." "Me too," I admitted. "I do believe the Wendigo was going to call us in the woods, in the middle of our dream state," Felix admitted. "We have to pray to God that Ian Fierceling knows what he's doing and can help us, or we're pretty much doomed, Barker. Because we can't fight against something in our sleep, can we?" "Please don't say that, Felix," I said, shuddering. "I do think Ian Fierceling knows about the Wendigo. He knows things other adults don't know about. I'm sure he can help us. He says he's got a friend who can help us." I said this, my words were etched with uncertainty. Ian Fierceling's front door abruptly opened, and there his tall, lanky figure was standing on the front porch. He beckoned us over, keeping his voice very low and mute. "Good.
I'm very glad you boys came along. It's very important that you did. Zamander should be here in any moment. He'll have some answers for us, I'm most sure."
"Who's Zamander?" I asked.
"Never you mind about that," said Ian fiercely. "Let's see if he's around, shall we?"
I nearly jumped out of my skin when Ian Fierceling let out a loud owl hoot that was so lifelike, so very real, you would have thought an owl was perching on a tree only yards away from us and hooting like mad. What was Ian Fierceling doing, I wondered? And then, to my absolute amazement, there was another owl hoot in response, returned very promptly, and that was when I realized the owl hoots were some kind of secret code to alert Zamander to our presence, whoever Zamander was.
"Good," said Ian Fierceling. "Zamander is here. He responded to my call. He knows all about the Wendigo and the portal in the woods that opens up at night. He will tell you how you can protect yourself from the Wendigo, so that you will be safe when you go to bed. You must listen to him very carefully. He speaks in a different language to us, but he uses a translation code in our heads, which is telepathic, so you will understand precisely what he's saying."
"What language does he speak?" I asked excitedly. "I can speak Norwegian, German and Italian, and I'm fluent in all three languages."
"You are?" said Ian Fierceling, looking decidedly impressed. "No, I'm afraid Zamander does not speak those languages, but he can understand them all, because when you talk to him he can read your mind, and that is when language is no obstacle."
"What language does he speak, then?" Mr. Fierceling, I asked curiously.
"I'd be damned if I know, young man," said Mr. Fierceling.
I was rather puzzled that Mr. Fierceling didn't know the language his friend spoke, which seemed decidedly odd to me, but I chose to say nothing about it, and patiently waited for his friend to arrive. If I thought the world was a strange place up to then, it certainly became infinitely stranger when I saw the tall, shadowy figure of something decidedly enormous gliding towards us. My first thought was, "What the hell is that huge thing?" I could feel my heart beginning to thunder violently in my chest, so fast, in fact, that I became like a jelly bean being shaken around in a bottle. I think Ian Fierceling sensed my growing sense of disquiet. As the giant hair-covered beast moved towards us, Felix had uttered the words out loud. "What is that?"
"Sorry, I forgot to mention. Zamander is a Bigfoot," said Ian Fierceling.
So matter-of-factly, in fact, as if being friends with a Bigfoot was as natural as breathing.
"Don't worry, kids. He means you no harm. He's a very gentle fellow. He's here to help you. Don't be intimidated by his great size."
If I thought Ian Fierceling, the recluse in our street, had a mediocre, mundane life, I was seriously mistaken about that. Ian Fierceling had interactions with creatures like Bigfoot. He knew about the Wendigo. He knew about the portal in the woods. He knew about ghosts. There was nothing remotely ordinary about his life. Moments later, Zamander was standing yards away from us. He was so huge that next to him I felt positively tiny. And let me tell you, that's a first for me, given I come from a family of human giants, due to my Norwegian roots. The Bigfoot was easily 9 foot tall, possibly more, robustly built with proportions that a heavy-weight lifter could only dream of acquiring. For the first time in my life, I suddenly felt pathetically small. At school I hated towering over all the boys in my class, but Zamander was now towering over us, like an elephant over a few little rabbits in the field. We had become those rabbits. I was completely intimidated by the seemingly imperial majesty that Zamander exuded. He possessed a wisdom of such depth, the likes I have never seen before in my life. Of course, I've heard stories of Bigfoot before, but the creatures have always been spoken of as being inferior to human beings, as if in some way they're so much more primitive than ourselves. But nothing could have been less true in this case. In Zamander's own presence, I felt being human made me, Felix, and Mr. Fierceling inferior to the Bigfoot's might, strength, and infinite knowledge, which far surpassed that of our own. When the Bigfoot spoke, his voice boomed like a clap of thunder in the sky that demanded respect. and immediately I paid swift attention to his every word. This human-like creature was covered in pitch-black hair, although the hair on his chin was completely white. His wizened but kindly brown eyes gave off a pronounced yellow eye-shine.
Kapinatala hankosolo dilani asikakwila hampolenatolo. I have come,
said Zamanda. He turned to me, his voice very deep.
I understand that both you boys have got yourself into a bit of a pickle. Am I right about that?
Yes, sir, I said, not knowing how else to address a Bigfoot. My father had always told me that if a man was older than me, that I needed to call him sir, so that is what I did.
Kampinata osholakina hosa tolokatina himatila walazina zadali noko hazina tolabani. You have been in contact with the Wendigo, said the Bigfoot. You are going to need my urgent help, for the Wendigo will stop at nothing to draw you back into the woods when you fall asleep. So I have a plan.
And with that the Bigfoot brought out a leather purse filled with a sizable collection of stones that he began to shake around in the bag. He asked me and Felix to pull out the stone that we were drawn to, that was warm to the touch.
Kantala tolo matilakwa sasina. I want you to pull out the stone in the bag, the one that feels warm to the touch, for that will be the correct stone for you. You will sleep with a stone under your pillow for 7 consecutive nights, so the Wendigo will not be able to manipulate or intercept your dreams. After the 7 days are up, you must bury the stone under a tree in your yard, and all will be well, for there will be a veil of protection around your yard.
I felt around in the leather bag for a stone that was warm to the touch, but most of the stones were cold. But finally I found one that was very warm, and the more I held it in my hand, the hotter it became. I drew it out of the bag. It was blue in colour. And for 7 nights Felix and I both slept with our individual stones under our pillows. We both slept better than we'd ever slept before a day in our lives. Once the 7 days were up, we each buried our individual stone in the earth near a tree in our yard. I was exceedingly grateful to both Ian Fierceling and Zamanda the Bigfoot for helping us against the Wendigo, and I never forgot their kindness towards us. Certainly after that event, me and Felix befriended Ian Fierceling and would visit him regularly for tea. We never did get to see Zamanda again, but I do know he's out there in the woods, watching over that portal that opens up every night. And as for the ghost of Deirdre Horace, whether she's around I do not know, but there has been no more sightings of her by the locals in our area, so I hope that she's found her peace in some way. Me and Felix never told our parents we knew about their secret concerning the mix-up over our births, as I believe, and we both believe, that some secrets should be left well alone, and this is clearly one of them. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.